This is not a healing pool. By Jgrupe Horror. I live near a healing spring. It's famous around the world. You may have heard of it. Then again, maybe not. It's a well-known tourist trap about half an hour away from my house by car, so I can go there any time I like. Others have spent their entire lives saving up, dreaming of going there, hoping to heal their terminal illness or broken body after hearing a story on the news or from a website. And it works. Not all the time, of course, but every once in a while, someone steps into the little lake and comes out completely healed. X-rays and CAT scans, MRIs and ultrasounds, they confirm the impossible. The doctors will even tell them, this is a miracle. The church will be notified and it gets put into writing that a person was supernaturally healed. These types of documented events are extremely rare. Each miracle is closely followed up on, and if the healing isn't permanent, it is no longer considered a miracle. But that's never happened to my knowledge. Whatever goes on down there, under the murky mineral water, it sticks. The thing is, I've always been suspicious of the world-famous healing spring. The church is so secretive about it, they refuse to allow any scientific experiments to be done on the water or the soil there. This, despite the fact that everything from cancer to MS to bone degeneration had been cured by the mystery water. They've owned the land for centuries. I asked permission once to take some scuba gear into the water and try and run some tests, and they refuse vehemently. Even under supervision, they won't allow any sort of exploration. Security guards patrol the shore, and bags are inspected upon entering, so there's no way to sneak my equipment in during the day when the place is open. But I thought of another way. I suppose I should explain why I'm so curious, why I don't just trust the priests when they say it was simply God healing the sick with his divine power. I believe that's possible, mind you, but that's not what's happening here. When I was 8 years old, we went to visit the healing spring with my uncle. He had suffered from Parkinson's disease for years, and they thought perhaps he could be cured through the divine power of the pool. His entire body was shaking, and he had stepped into the water with tentative, quivering strides. But when he emerged from the pale blue lake, he was a different man. As he swam into the deepest part of the water, I saw his head go under and his eyes widened in surprise. It looked like someone had grabbed him by the ankle and pulled him under. When he came back up, he looked different. He came forth from the beach on sturdy legs, his gait sure and purposeful. I saw him walk right up to my mother and look her dead in the eyes, his face slack and expressionless. "I'm fixed," he had said, with a total lack of joy or enthusiasm. "Let's get out of this place." As he spoke, I thought to myself, this man is not my uncle anymore. But of course my mum refused to believe it. She figured he was the same old Uncle Dan, only healed. I told her that Uncle Dan was in trouble. He was still at the bottom of the lake. This new man, the new Uncle Dan, said not to be silly, and that he was standing right there in front of me. But when he spoke, his eyes flashed with something evil and full of hate for me at having spoken. They flickered pale blue for a second, like a second eyelid blinking sideways, then back to brown. He winked at me and smiled, and I saw his tongue now looked far too big for his mouth. It was bunched up and folded over, crammed into his maw like dinner leftovers in a bowl too small to hold them. His yellow smoke-stained teeth were now white as snow, and he grinned widely, showing them to me. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but I knew it was true. I was just lying to myself because I was scared. Who am I kidding? I was fucking petrified. The new Uncle Dan was not a nice man. Whereas my old uncle had sung and joked and danced on his wobbly legs, this man was serious, mean, and quick to anger. If I dropped something or took too long to get him a drink, he was always thirsty now, he would turn bright red and scream at me in a deep and terrible voice. "Hurry up, you little shit. What the fuck is taking your stupid ass so long?" He would yell and scream and curse. He never joked anymore. Before that, he always had a joke or two. My mum stopped visiting him after a few months, and then pretty soon they barely spoke. But she never admitted I had been right. She stubbornly insisted that this doppelganger, this imposter, was still her brother. He had to be. I knew she was wrong, and worse yet, I had a feeling, a very overwhelming inkling, that Uncle Dan was still down at the bottom of that lake. It was like he was calling out to me for help from down there. If I could only find his body, I could prove the man wasn't really him, that he'd simply stolen my uncle's life. So one night, when I was in my late 20s, full of pride and fearlessness, I made my way over to the property. I had all my gear, my flippers, wetsuit, air tank, regulator, hoses, a waterproof camera, flashlight, and everything else I needed. I had been preparing for years to do this. I drove past the gated entrance a little ways and parked at the side of the road in the tall grass. I got out of my car and made my way through the forest towards the little lake. The night sky was clear and cloudless. The full moon shone up above and lit my path as I walked through the brush. I had to hide once or twice when I saw the flashlight beams of security guards patrolling the area, but kept moving again once they had passed by. I slipped through the woods as quickly and quietly as I could, making my way towards the healing pool further within the property. The security guards were everywhere, dozens of them. Why did they need such protection for a little lake, I wondered. It only convinced me further that something sinister was happening here. After a few close calls, once nearly walking right into a guard and only avoiding detection just barely, I reached the water's edge. The surface was still and black, reflecting a mirror image of the stars and moon above. I saw something move in the water, and then it disappeared a second later. Probably just a fish or a frog, I thought to myself. I put on my equipment, still hiding at the edge of the forest next to the water. After a few moments of gathering my courage, I stepped into the inky black water. It was thick with minerals and difficult to see. I took out my flashlight and turned it on. The visibility was still poor, but slightly better now. I kicked my legs and was propelled forward into the depths, my flippers making the work easy. I'm not sure exactly what I was expecting to find down there, but I definitely wasn't expecting what I saw next. Those look like giant figs, I remember thinking to myself. Have you ever eaten a fig? You know, when you cut one open and inside are all those little tiny alien-looking finger hairs? Like cilia on a microscope cell, but larger. They group together like a mouth in the middle. That's what I saw. There were dozens of them, and they dotted the floor of the lake. They opened up like flowers blooming as I approached, and at the center of each large fig mouth was a white bulb the size of a cantaloupe. They appeared to be plants growing on the bottom of the lake, but they were massive, over 15 feet tall. I had never seen anything like them before in my life. They were purple and gold and moved as if they were alive. As I got closer, I saw strange vines as well, coiled like snakes at the base of each plant. I swam down to look and saw they were moving around like snakes. The white bulb at the center of the plant closest to me moved suddenly. I was far too close to it, I realized too late, my heart pounding with fear. The white round thing rotated downwards, and I saw what looked like eyes staring at me from it. I couldn't pry my eyes away, despite my rising terror. I looked closer and realized whose eyes they were. It was Uncle Dan, only his face was pale and bloated. His brown eyes were wide and afraid, just as they looked that day when he went under the water and disappeared almost 20 years before. His entire body was enveloped in the cilia of the thing's mouth. He looked like he had been swallowed alive by the disgusting purple fig plant. The little finger hairs moved around his head and wiggled around with sudden activity. They fluttered up and down and seemed to draw him back in as he struggled. His head wriggled and squirmed, and I saw he was still fighting to get free. He was alive. Nearly 2 decades later, he was still alive. I saw his bloated face was covered in fibrous plant material, which made it impossible for him to scream or open his mouth. The plant was feeding him oxygen and nutrients, I realized. It was keeping him alive. But why? I felt something wrapping around my ankles and looked down with increasing fear. I was pulled down suddenly, and I saw a long vine had ensnared my leg like a boa constrictor. Not good. Not good at all. I looked and saw it was pulling me in towards the open mouth of one of the giant purple figs. This one looked younger and slightly smaller. I got the feeling when it got me in its clutches, it would hold me in its terrifying mouth forever, just like my Uncle Dan. And not only that, but there would suddenly be a new me created, a meaner, thirstier me. My thoughts raced and I suddenly remembered my knife. I managed to grab it as the vine dug deeper into my leg. I could feel it squeezing my bones and crushing my body tissues with its powerful grip. I reached down and slashed at the vine with my blade, cutting shallow gashes into the tough skin of the thing. Its grip stayed firm and it didn't relent. With increasing horror, I realized it was wrapping itself even more tightly around my ankle and squeezing tighter and tighter. I began to feel pins and needles in my foot. I reached down again, and this time I tried to saw with the blade, running my knife back and forth quickly and ineffectively as panic began to take hold of me. Fear swelled and grew within me as I saw the monstrous plant was very close now, its alien mouth opening and closing, the cilia moving around with anticipation as if the thing were licking its lips with hunger. This one did not have a white bulb at its centre. It wanted me for that coveted place. I sawed with the knife, harder and quicker, my heart beating fast and heavy in my chest, loud enough I could hear it in my ears. The pain in my leg was incredible. The thing felt like it was made of stone. I hacked and dug with the pointed tip of the blade and tried fruitlessly to gain purchase on the writhing tentacle. The knife slipped and skidded painfully into my skin, causing me to wince in sudden sharp pain of another variety. Another vine came up and began to pull at my mask, trying to rip it off my face. I slashed and hacked with the knife and managed to cut off a piece of this thinner vine, and it retreated, but several others began to approach from the depths. This was not going well. The agony in my ankle and foot grew until it went completely numb, as the pins and needles sensation went away to be replaced by a heavy pressure pain. I pictured my foot turning increasingly darker shades of purple. At that moment, I was beyond desperate. The pain in my leg was worse than anything I had ever thought possible, and my hacking and sawing at the vine was making no progress. I took a deep breath and began to saw at my own leg, rather than the tentacle that had ensnared it, making quick progress on the flesh below the kneecap. Compared to the vine, my leg made for easy work. The knife cut through the skin and tendon like it was tough steak. The pain was terrible, but the idea of getting free was better, and I continued sawing, biting down on the regulator mouthpiece and trying desperately to keep breathing. I reached bone and continued to saw with the serrated parts of the blade. I was making tiny bits of progress and starting to become slightly hopeful when one of the vines pulled off my face mask and another yanked the regulator out of my mouth. I managed to get one last good breath in before my air source was pulled away. I held my breath and swung the knife wildly, trying to scare the tentacles off, then went back to my leg. I was through the bone, finally. My hand continued to saw through the other side, and I felt a huge weight drop off below me as my dismembered foot fell down into the depths. Kicking with my one remaining leg, I swam up to the surface. The other vines brushed against me as I escaped, but I managed to get away without any of them managing to grab me. I got up to the surface of the water and took huge, gasping breaths of fresh air. My legs screamed in agony and I struggled towards the beach. When I got there, several security guards were waiting for me. I got the impression they had no idea what happened beneath the lake at the bottom. They were simply hired goons. Their faces regarded me with pity as I coughed up water from my lungs and screamed in pain. "You lose your other leg?" one of them asked dully. Luckily, they felt bad for me and dialed 911 before calling their bosses. I managed to escape from the place in the back of an ambulance and wound up in a nearby hospital on the trauma unit there. I was there for over 3 months. After multiple surgeries, they managed to make a stump that could be fitted for a prosthesis. The nurses and doctors were amazing, giving me encouragement and support as I made my healing journey, as they called it. I guess I shouldn't laugh. It really was a trip. I worked with the prosthesists and occupational therapists, physiotherapists and orthopedic surgeons, rehab specialists, and finally, outpatient treatment clinics. It was at one of my infrequent visits to one of these clinics recently that something happened which prompted me to write this. I was sitting on the steel table in the examination room, trying not to slide off and tumble down to the floor as the disposable paper covering slipped beneath me. The occupational therapist walked in with her student at her side. They regarded me for a moment and looked at their clipboard together, as one. Their eyes looked up to me from the clipboard, 2 pairs together at the same time. Their eyelids didn't close, but I saw them blink a second set of eyes, sideways. Their irises flickered pale blue for just a second, and they smiled at me. "What are you doing here?" the occupational therapist asked me. "Didn't you hear about the healing spring? It's very close. We can show you." Her long tongue slipped out of her mouth as she spoke, and she poked it back in. A thick purple and gold vine. There's something deadly in the lakes of New Zealand. Original horror by One More Nightmare, featuring Ponch Monster Studios and Creepy Oz. The sun sat high in the New Zealand sky as the bus rumbled into Wanaka, a picturesque town nestled between the Southern Alps and Lake Wanaka. I was waiting eagerly at the station for Tony and Kerry, 2 friends I met while I was working in Australia over 12 years ago. We had instantly hit it off, quickly becoming a tight trio of friends and doing everything together. Even when Tony and Kerry took their relationship to the next level and I became the dreaded third wheel, our bond stayed strong. I had moved back to New Zealand just over a year ago for work and family, and we had kept in touch with weekly Zoom calls and WhatsApp messaging, though over time I had noticed that our Zoom calls became shorter and the gaps between our messages longer. That's why when they had told me that they planned to come over for a holiday, I practically jumped around my lounge room in excitement, tears literally welling in my eyes. The bus pulled up to the stop, hissing as it lowered to the curb before the doors folded open. I lifted my large handwritten sign, accompanied with their enlarged passport photos that said, "Welcome back from prison, Tony and Kerry." A little jab at Australia's convict history. A few other passengers disembarked first, pointing at my sign with a smile on their face, as if they were in on the joke, before Tony and Kerry came down the stairs and out the door, immediately cracking up at the sign.
"Ah, come on, bro,"
Tony said in his bad Kiwi accent he had used when we first met. What? This is how we welcome all Aussies to New Zealand. That's if you're allowed off the plane, of course, I replied, smiling ear to ear.
"Give us a hug, you bloody wombat,"
Kerry said, dropping her bag and reaching out. I threw the sign to the side and gave Kerry a hug before breaking away to slap hands with Tony and pull him in for a hug as well. I grabbed Kerry's bag and we headed off to the car park, chatting away just like old times.
Wow, that lake, that view is real nice.
Kerry had said as we drove up the hill towards my place. The lake stretched out beside us, reflecting the blue sky and surrounding mountains. The pristine waters and lush greenery seemed to go on forever.
It's massive.
Tony added. Yeah, it is. It's like nearly 4 times the size of Loch Ness and even deeper. And it's not even the biggest lake in New Zealand, I said. So glad I finally got to show off the amazing views I got to see every day. We pulled up to my place, unloaded the car and ate. As the evening settled in, we found ourselves in the backyard, lounging in a covered bubbling hot tub with drinks in hand. Laughter echoed as we reminisced about some of the crazier things we got up to in Australia. The hours passed effortlessly by, and before we knew it, it was 2:30 in the morning. Right, guys, we got an early-ish start tomorrow, I slurred. Time to hit the sack. No funny business, okay? They're brand new sheets in there.
No worries. We'll just use your couch.
Tony said dryly as he slowly climbed out of the hot tub.
Shut up, Tony.
Kerry said, hitting him on the arm as I laughed.
Don't worry. Tony will be asleep before his head hits the pillow.
Oh, and don't forget, it's a duvet over here, not a doona.
Right you are. Now, where are my bloody thongs?
Jandals, mate. Jandals. Unless you're wearing Kerry's underwear again. We all laughed again as I pulled the lid over the hot tub, switched off the lights, and headed inside for the night. The next day started a little later than planned. Slightly hungover, possibly still drunk, we managed to attach the trailer to the car and load ourselves full of coffee. About 2 hours later than planned, we were finally on the road. Our destination was the abandoned Boundary Creek campsite near the top end of Lake Wanaka, just under an hour's drive away. The plan was to park in the abandoned campsite, unload the 3 kayaks on the trailer, then kayak across the lake to a secluded cove with a sandy beach. The only access to the beach was by boat or kayak, and almost no one knew about it. There, we could swim, relax, cook up a feed, and have a hear of the dog, what my Australian mates would say about having a drink the next day to get rid of a hangover.
Is this Lake Wanaka too?
Kerry asked as we drove beside a large lake on our right. Nah, this one's Lake Hawea. It runs next to Lake Wanaka, I replied, glancing out the window at the massive body of water beside us.
Wow.
Was all she replied. 30 minutes later, we pulled up to the turn-off to the Boundary Creek campsite. Blocking the gravel road was a few orange road cones and temporary fencing. I pulled over, putting the car in park, and unclipped my seatbelt. Come on, Tony, gonna need your help with this. Without questioning me, he jumped out of the car and followed me to the fence. Here, move these cones, then let's make a big enough gap to squeeze the car and trailer in, I said, grabbing the first cone and moving it aside.
Roger,
Tony replied, grabbing the other cone. Once we had moved the temporary fencing enough to get the car through, Tony said,
Yeah, I'll wait here and move it back once you're in.
Sweet, sounds good, I said as I jogged back to the car. There wasn't much traffic around, as this end of Lake Wanaka was largely uninhabited and tourists generally stayed closer to Wanaka, so I was confident no one would see us. Still, I didn't want to muck around in case some Karen or Ken drove past and reported us. I drove through the gap we created and waited while Tony moved the cones and fence back, then began the short drive to the campsite area. The site itself was basic, a toilet block the only building, surrounded by camping spots for tents and caravans.
Why is this place closed?
Kerry asked as we pulled up next to the toilets. Apparently, a couple of years back, a bunch of campers went missing overnight. Their tents and cars, all that, were still here, and their chairs were all sitting around a burnt-out fire pit, but they were gone. Police searched for weeks, the scuba teams came in, and they couldn't find any trace of them, I replied.
Bullshit.
Tony snorted, waiting for me to crack a smile or laugh. His smile disappeared as he read my face, seeing that I was telling the truth.
That's crazy. How'd they not find them?
Kerry said. I don't think people realise how huge that lake is. If they ended up in the water and drowned, you would never find them unless they washed up on shore one day.
Well, just as well we know what we're doing then.
Tony said, the smile returning to his face. Do we though? I replied sarcastically, opening my door and stepping out into the bright sun. After storing our supplies in the kayaks, we ran through a quick safety briefing of our sit-in kayaks, made sure the spray skirts fit well, and did a couple of dry, wet exit refreshers. Once we launched the kayaks into the lake and checked each other's spray skirt was attached properly with the grab loop on the outside, we began our journey across the water, steering ourselves towards the beach cove, known only to locals. I had switched my normal prescription glasses for prescription sunnies, knowing how intense the glare bouncing off the water at this time of day would be. I tossed up bringing my normal pair with me as well, but I worried that if I somehow lost them both, I would be unable to drive safely later. While I'm far from blind without them, my sight is blurry, and in the evenings it's hard for me to see the road without them. The kayaks glided effortlessly, responding to the subtle shifts in our body as we steered. There was a sense of unity with the water, a connection that heightened our awareness of the natural world. The rhythmic sound of our paddles slicing through the water created a soothing melody that harmonized with the gentle lapping of the waves against the kayak's hull. For the longest time, we didn't talk, just paddled, taking in the sight of the surrounding landscape until we neared the halfway point of our journey.
This is amazing,
Tony said, breaking the sounds of the lapping waves. I was about to agree with him when I felt my kayak drop suddenly, as though there were a substantial shift in the water beneath me. My heart skipped a beat as I looked around, skimming my eyes across the surface of the water as the kayak rocked violently side to side. The others hadn't noticed, their focus elsewhere as they paddled on slowly. Without warning, I felt the water move again on my left side, dropping the kayak quickly and violently. I tried to use the paddle to support my balance, but I was too slow and helpless as I felt the kayak flip. The abrupt immersion into the cold, clear water of the lake sent a shock through my senses. The cold water enveloped me, seizing my breath and causing an instant jolt of awareness. The unexpected flip of the kayak sent me into a whirl of splashes and disorientation, the sound muffled in my new underwater environment. In the process of flipping, I had lost grip of my paddle and my glasses had flown from my face. Instantly, though, my experience kicked in as I cleared my head. At first, I reached for my grab loop, just to make sure it was there and ready if I needed to do a wet exit. It was. I reached to the underside of the kayak, which was now facing the sky, and banged on it with both hands 3 times, before rubbing my hands up and down the underside of the kayak. This alerts the others, if they haven't already noticed my current predicament, so they hopefully turn and paddle quickly to me. Once they hit my kayak, I can grab theirs and use it to pull myself up and out of the water. This prevents me from having to exit the kayak and potentially losing all my supplies. As I continued to rub my hands up and down the kayak's keel, my mind shifted to the reason the kayak had flipped in the first place. I swear it had felt like something large had displaced the water, causing my imbalance. But this was New Zealand. The largest things we have in our lakes are trouts and eels, neither large enough to rock a kayak, let alone tip one. I glanced down into the depths below. My heart rate increased, the darkness and opacity of the lake's depths creating an ominous atmosphere, sparking the imagination with thoughts of hidden creatures and submerged unknowns. The profound stillness added to the eerie ambience, as if the lake was holding its breath, keeping its secrets shrouded in the depths. My hands continued rubbing, faster now, more desperate. I continued surveying the dark abyss when suddenly, movement 100 meters below caught my eye. A greenish shimmer-like reflection grabbed my attention as it looked like something glided through the water, almost like a shark would. Suddenly my kayak was rocked by a huge bang, and I realized Tony or Kerry had come to my assistance. I took one last quick glance back down to where I thought I had seen the movement only moments ago, but was once again greeted by just a dark, empty abyss. I grabbed the bow of the kayak that had come to my aid and flipped myself up, my hand slipping slightly as I almost toppled back over, before fully righting myself and sucking in a huge breath of air.
Are you all right?
Kerry asked, genuine concern in her voice. I sucked in a few more mouthfuls of air, wiping my face with my hand before using both hands to clear my hair from my forehead. Yeah, thanks. I lost my glasses, but aside from that, I'm good now, I replied, heart rate slowly returning to normal.
Looks like you lost my respect too.
Tony chimed in with a smirk as he paddled over with my paddle lying across his lap.
Not that you had much to begin with.
Yeah, well, I'm more devastated about the glasses. At least they were something I wanted to keep, I replied jokingly, grabbing my paddle off him as he got close. But thanks for getting this for me.
All good. What actually happened there? You not off or something?
He asked.
Are you sure you're all good?
Kerry chipped in. Yeah, I'm good. I think it was just a small rogue wave caught me off guard, I lied. Let's get moving. I need to warm up again. I started paddling, not waiting for an answer. I just wanted to get to land as soon as possible, to process everything that had just happened. While the movement in the depths below could be passed off as me just imagining things, whatever had caused the water to move so violently was harder for me to process. We continued paddling, eventually reaching the hidden cove with the private sandy beach. Beers were cracked open, tunes played, and a fire crackled as we relaxed in the seclusion of this untouched paradise. Tony and I kicked a rugby ball around for a bit, though he kept trying to handball it to me like an AFL player. None of that here, mate. You're in rugby land now, I joked.
Righto, mate. That's the one where the big blokes just run into each other, eh? Lots of skill there,
he replied, always ready with a smart-ass response. Nah, it's the one where the players actually have to catch the ball and not fumble it around on the ground like a game of hockey without sticks, I shot back. We continued to joke around, kicking and passing the ball. Kerry got involved too, as we sank a few more drinks and ate our packed food we had brought with us. The more drinks I had, the easier it was to forget about the events that happened on the lake. The day passed by, and soon it was evening. There was still plenty of light left in the day, but the sun was now over the mountains that surrounded us, casting long shadows over the water. Reluctantly, we packed up and began the journey back across the lake. The summer evening was still warm, although in the middle of the lake, with no direct sunlight, the cold air coming off the water sent a shiver through me. We paddled on, my sight a little blurry from the fact I had no glasses on, as well as all the booze in my system. That is why, when I first thought I saw a green-tinged fin break the water behind me, I thought it was just a wave cresting in the lake. It wasn't until it was much closer that I realized it was something much more terrifying. It moved with such grace, rising up and down as it sliced through the water towards us. Once it was closer, I could see it was webbed and seemed to be at least 3 or 4 feet tall. It then submerged, maybe 20 feet behind me. The whole time my voice had been caught in my throat, not quite believing what I was seeing. I felt my kayak drop again as the thing passed beneath me at tremendous speed. I opened my mouth to scream and warn the others, but was too late. The water exploded around Tony's kayak, spraying 20 feet up in the air or more. Through the wall of water, we saw a scaly, green-grey clawed hand reach up and grab Tony's kayak, pulling it underwater in an instant. Shock paralysed us for a moment before Tony's kayak shot back out of the water, landing upside down. I paddled furiously towards his kayak as Kerry started screaming. As I got closer, I noticed large tears in the hole and, more horrifyingly, blood in the water. I pulled up to the kayak and dropped my paddle in the water, grabbing at Tony's kayak, desperately trying to flip it over. I wish I hadn't. When it finally flipped over, the black spray skirt was still attached to the kayak. Tony, however, had been ripped in half, his legs and lower half of his torso still in the kayak, intestines and organs slipping over the edge and into the water. His upper half was completely gone. Kerry screamed even louder at the sight, and I gagged as parts of Tony's intestines slid over my hand holding the kayak. "Go, Kerry, now! Paddle for the shore!" I screamed. The water broke again, and through the watery explosion I saw what looked like a reptile-like sea creature burst out of the water, landing on Kerry's kayak and dragging her under. Her scream was instantly cut off as the wall of water came splashing back down. Panic set in, my fight or flight activated, and I started paddling with all my strength, not looking back as I heard what I assumed to be Kerry's kayak shoot back out of the water. I paddled furiously, tears welling in my eyes, lungs burning from the intensity. I heard water breaking behind me, the sound of something breaching the water, giving chase. I pushed on harder, my hands hurting as my grip intensified on the paddles, blisters forming and tearing. Then, to my side, a dark shadow below the surface of the water moved with purpose before disappearing into the depths. Suddenly, my kayak was hit from below, sending me flying in the air. The paddle flew from my hands as I lifted 10 feet, maybe more, into the air. I braced for impact, slamming into the water at speed. I found myself submerged, surrounded by bubbles. Frantically flailing about, I saw a flash of a green eye in the water right below me as something huge moved towards me before everything went black and I passed out. I awoke on the shore of the Boundary Creek campsite, disoriented and alone. My kayak and all my belongings, including my phone and car keys, were nowhere to be found. Slowly, I made my way back to the road where I flagged down a passing car. The occupants, a mouldy husband and wife, listened intently to what I could recall as they drove me to the nearest town. Their expressions darkened as I recounted the events. I was sure they wouldn't believe me, or worse, would think that I'm crazy. But after a moment of solemn silence, the husband spoke. "Sounds like a taniwha." He explained that taniwhas were mythical creatures in Māori folklore, often associated with bodies of water. They were said to be shape-shifting guardians or protectors, but crossing paths with them could bring misfortune. The wife nodded in agreement, emphasizing the significance of the encounter. My friends' bodies and kayaks were never recovered. The police initially accused me of killing them and hiding their bodies and belongings, and tried to elicit a confession from me, but with no evidence, eventually had to let me go. I sold my property in Wanaka and moved as far from the water as I could, which, in New Zealand, is very hard to do. I don't know if it was a taniwha or if it was some other undiscovered deep water creature, but I do know this. I will never go in the water again as long as I live. There are things here in the New Zealand lakes, things that kill. If you see a searchlight too soon after capsizing in the North Pacific Ocean, hide. By Manon Lysette. A few years ago, I was working as a deckhand on an Alaskan fishing boat. From a young age, my parents instilled in me a strong work ethic. They always said hard work leads to greater returns, so I naturally gravitated towards a career that shared that philosophy. Alaskan fishing added high risk to the equation, and in turn, the rewards were even sweeter. I couldn't imagine doing anything else, and planned on working my way up to captain one day. This story takes place during my 5th crabbing season. By then, I knew the ropes, I was familiar with the waters, and I'd witnessed a few deaths firsthand. I thought I was prepared for anything. I was dead wrong. We were a crew of 15, myself included, when the season began. That number would be halved by the time we returned to shore, and I would be left incapable of setting foot anywhere near the ocean ever again. I was sailing on the Seaward Sarah, a vessel that was getting a little long in the tooth, but was known for her reliability. Since she'd passed her safety inspection earlier that year, I had no concerns as we left port for the cold waters of the North Pacific Ocean. It was exhilarating to be on the sea again, with the fresh, salty breeze and waters so vast you couldn't see anything but blue for miles around. Spirits were high, and the excitement of starting off on a new journey was electric. We always hold a party on the first and last nights. It was tradition. Even the captain would join in and dance and sing and drink. We noticed the first sign of trouble 2 days into the journey. The Seaward Sarah was listing on her starboard side. It wasn't at a dangerous angle, and after consulting the ship's engineer, the captain determined it was safe to proceed farther into the North Pacific Ocean. He planned on balancing her out once we started loading crabs into the cargo decks. We'd overfill the port cargo and underfill the starboard. I didn't question the plan. It seemed reasonable, and besides, I was just a deckhand. The captain could piss in my mouth, tell me it was wine, and I'd smile and agree. That's the way it works at sea. I grew more concerned as the voyage went on. The list worsened over the course of the next week. It went from a barely noticeable incline to my calves burning from straining against the pull of gravity towards starboard. That's when the captain started making a lot of calls. I couldn't hear what was going on, but I could see him shouting into the receiver, his face getting redder and angrier as the days wore on. I was told he was cursing everyone from the ship manufacturer to the inspectors to the contractors who'd last done repair work on her hull. I was told it was business as usual. One evening, when most of us were gathered in the dining hall, holding our plates and glasses to keep them from sliding down the table, the captain burst in and announced we were turning over. Our reactions were mixed, with some experiencing relief and others disappointed. No one knew what this meant for our wages or whether the repairs would be done in time to get back at sea before the end of crab season. Me, I was one of the ones who was relieved by the news. The vast ocean I'd been yearning for months had become progressively more unsettling as the ship tilted. I became keenly aware just how far away I was from dry land, from safety. This place I found freeing suddenly felt like a cage, and I wanted out. I felt the Seaward Sarah turn as I headed back to the crew quarters and used the wall for support. The combination of the dime turn and the ship's tilt were terrible for my equilibrium. I needed to lay down and let myself adjust. I don't know what would have happened if the storm hadn't hit later that night. Would the Seaward Sarah have limped home safely? Would she have rolled over along the way? I'll never know now, because the storm did hit. One that seemed to come out of nowhere, barely being caught by the radar before its waves and rain started pelting the ship with the fury of an angry sea god. The Seaward Sarah groaned in pain as her list worsened even more. Doors flew open, Objects fell and hit me as I staggered up the hull towards the deck. I didn't realise just how bad it had gotten until I felt my feet touch the wall and realised the wall was becoming the floor. I was still inside when I heard the call to abandon ship. I was bruised, groggy and disoriented. Enough water had gotten in from somewhere that I was also soaked. I felt a pair of hands grab me by the shoulder and usher me forward when I stopped to take a breath. I know at some point I donned a life vest, but I couldn't tell you when or how I got it. All I remember is the surreal sensation of the world changing direction inside the ship, and the sight of the tall waves illuminated by lightning once outside. Thunder drowned out the screams of my shipmates, but I could see them scrambling to launch a lifeboat. I threw myself towards them, but before I could catch a handhold, I felt a wall of ice-cold water drag me into the railing. A second wave, the reaction to its action, reached over the rail and pulled me into the water. The pain was unbearable. Not only had I been tossed around like a rag doll, but the water felt like I'd rolled into a vat of quicksand made of sharp needles. I didn't know which side was up and which was down, but thankfully the life vest lifted me back to the turbulent surface. The water had gotten into my ears, muffling the sound of the storm, and I tried to flail my arms, hoping for rescue, but I couldn't lift them. I couldn't stop treading water long enough. This hell went on for longer than I care to reflect on. I just know wave after wave pulled me under, but the jacket always brought me back up long enough to catch my breath. When I closed my eyes, even years later, I can still feel the unrelenting assault of the waves mingling with the taste of salt on my tongue. I was going to die, I was sure of it, either by not breathing in when I had a chance, or by drowning from rainwater in my mouth whenever I screamed. And then I felt a tug, and my horror amplified tenfold as I imagined being in the jaws of a sea serpent about to pull me into the ocean depths. I thrashed desperately, trying to escape, only to hear Greta's voice chastising me. "Stop that! I'm trying to pull you in." Greta hoisted me onto the lifeboat, and once I was over the edge, I slipped the rest of the way in, landing in wet and bloody water. I could hear orders being shouted at me, but all I could do was curl up and wait, utterly useless. I know the others were preoccupied by something as they started rowing as hard as they could. In hindsight, I think they were trying to get clear of the whirlpool of the sinking ship. The storm passed almost as quickly as it arrived. The ocean wasn't as quick to calm, but the turbulence lessened to a manageable degree. When I was finally able to, I sat up and took inventory of my surroundings. I found myself in a lifeboat with 7 other crewmates. All that was left of the seaward Sarah were bubbles rising from the depths of the ocean. Miraculously, there was a second lifeboat paddling towards us, and once we connected, we were overjoyed to find that every single crew member had survived the capsizing. The captain, who was in the other raft, shouted over the water in a deep, booming voice, "We sent out a distress call before she went down. They have our coordinates. It won't be long." I hoped he was right, because my hands were trembling from the cold and the quickly depleting adrenaline. We tied the rafts together, took stock of our supplies, food, first aid, and then waited. Now, you would think that there would be a cheering when the light appeared on the horizon, that all hands would start to paddle and wave and celebrate. Instead, there was a sudden and deathly silence as a communal swell of anxiety filtered into us. There were haunted expressions on Greta and John and Sarah and even the captain's face. The latter was holding the flare gun, but his finger was tapping nervously on the trigger. Sometimes, without knowing why, you get a bad feeling. People call it a sixth sense, but I think it's simpler than that. I think it's dangers perceived, but bypassed by the brain so you can act faster than you can think. Kind of like how you can actively analyze a person's body language to get more information than you'd get from hearing their words alone. But even if you're not trying to, you still subconsciously notice the little signs showing discomfort or anger or attraction. It's innate. What we think we perceive is only scratching the surface of all the information we truly take in. The brain, our consciousness, focuses on one thing, but our survival instinct notices the other discrepancies. And when it does, it signals danger without telling you why. "It's not moving," Greta whispered. She hit the nail on the head. She connected the dots outlining the proverbial red flag. When she did, a sort of unspoken acknowledgement travelled through the group as one by one we noticed it too. You see, there were two problems with the light. One, the nearest ship to ours was at least another 5 hours away, probably longer if they hit the same storm we had. And two, the light was perfectly still, staying at the same height and never once bobbing along with the ocean surge. It also wasn't sweeping the ocean, as one does when searching for survivors. You see, it had appeared way too fast, only about half an hour after the storm had passed. It was extremely unlikely that an unknown ship had been in the area. We all try to keep tabs on one another because in such turbulent waters, knowing where everyone is a question of life and death. Yes, we're technically all competing against one another, but you'd be hard-pressed to find any seaman unwilling to drop everything to save another in a pinch. There's a code of honour we all follow, but suppose this was an unknown vessel responding to our distress call. We still had to contend with the second issue of its unnatural immobility. My stomach contorted, wondering what that meant. This light was fixed on a single point in the near distance. It was glowing. No, pulsating. But it never once moved on any sort of axis like it should if it was searching the water, and it was immune to the push and pull of the ocean waves. There's not a ship on Earth that can do that. The only reasonable explanation was that it might be a Coast Guard helicopter hovering perfectly in place and dangerously low. But then again, even if it had been deployed the second the distress call was sent, a rescue chopper couldn't have gotten to us that fast. The light was impossible. The light felt menacing. The light acted like a lure, goading us to come to it. The boom of an explosion snapped me to reality, and it was followed by a crackle up above. The captain had fired off one of the flares. It hung in the air, slowly fizzling in a downward arc. I remember feeling so scared I dug my fingers into the lifeboat. The shot was one thing, but my fear had to do with the light. I was so afraid it would come closer now that it knew for sure where we were. I was more afraid of that light than I'd ever been of anything in my entire life. But thankfully, it stayed away. "Row," the captain ordered. No one moved, not even to breathe. "Row, damn it." John reached for the paddle, but Greta grabbed him by the forearm and stopped him, shaking her head. The captain glared at us with bulging eyes. He'd adopted an authoritative stance, but even he wasn't able to suppress his quakes of fear. If one followed logic, he was right. We should head towards the light. And yet, the longer we stared at the unwavering thing, the more it unsettled us. It's funny how something as simple as bobbing up and down could have alleviated our anxiety, but the light didn't do that, not even once. Faced with the soft mutiny, the captain grumbled and grabbed a paddle of his own. "Fine," he hissed. "I'll go. Any man or woman too cowardly to come can transfer to the coward's raft." He gestured to us. "Anyone with balls, come with me. We need to flag that ship down before it moves on without us." The flare hit the water and spat out a few more dying embers. I was surprised to see a few crewmates get up. John and a couple of others transferred over to the captain's raft. An equal number transferred to the coward's raft. With contempt on his sour, sea-worn face, the captain cut the lines between us and directed his raft towards the searchlight. Even as they rowed off, we pleaded with them not to go, but it was like they'd been infected with bravado. I could hear them chanting in a rhythm, left, right, until they were a blip on the horizon. 10 minutes after the voices went quiet, at the estimated time the captain's raft would have reached the light, it suddenly blinked out of existence. The captain, John, and the other 5 crewmates on that raft were never seen or heard from again. The rafters never turned up. This, despite being outfitted with an emergency tracker. Planes equipped with the same tech have gone missing as well, so it could be that those trackers aren't worth much, but it still gives me nightmares to think what would have happened to me if we'd followed the captain. As for us, it took 7 hours, but eventually we were rescued by the crew of the Rose Shannon. As expected, the storm had delayed rescue attempts. They warmed us up and combed the waters where we'd last seen the captain's raft, abandoning the search only when the Coast Guard arrived and took over. That night, I had nightmares of the light growing closer and closer, and every time its glow was about to hit me, I'd feel a pressure in my head like it was about to explode, and a searing, burning pain on my skin. Then, I'd wake up drenched in sweat. I now work as a trucker, a mercifully landlocked job. I drive through all kinds of creepy locations. I've seen some things on this job, but nothing has ever scared me more than the light I saw that terrible night. I don't know if it's because of the lack of closure around the captain's raft, or if my subconscious saw something that it felt my brain was better off not knowing. I don't know. I don't like to think about it, but now that I've written this, I think I can finally move on, in a way. I still keep in touch with Greta. She's still working out there. Props to her for getting back on that seahorse. She now captains her own vessel. I couldn't be happier for her. But sometimes, when we're catching up, she talks about that night, and she always follows it up by saying another ship's been lost at sea in that same area. I think they're up to 5 now. No survivors, although the final transmission of one of the ships mentioned seeing a light on the horizon. Sailors have come to avoid what they're calling the Alaska Triangle. Part of me wishes I knew conclusively what's happening out there, but I'm mostly glad I'm here on solid ground, far from the light. Thalassophobia by Butts the Slack Goursman. Sophia darted her head in all directions to try and find someone who could help her. However, there was nobody in sight, and only deep blue waters as far as the eye could see. The sky above her was a clear, bright blue, but there was no sign of the sun anywhere. Looking down, she could barely see into the water at all. It wasn't dirty, just dark. In fact, the water was cleaner than any ocean water she had ever seen. Pulling some water into her hands, she could detect no sign of grit or brine whatsoever, even though she was almost certain this was an ocean. Perhaps even more disturbingly, there was no sound or waves to be sensed. There wasn't even the sound of water splashing as she moved about. She tried swimming, and even though she could move, she couldn't get a clear sense of what direction she was going in, or if she was moving at all. That was when she felt something touch the bottom of her foot. It was so fast and brief that she didn't have time to discern what it felt like, but she felt it. She almost rocketed out of the water in terror. She couldn't even see her legs. The water was so dark. She splashed about, trying to swim as fast and far away as she could. Though she couldn't feel it on her skin, she could still feel its presence, swimming underneath her. She screamed out, getting the water in her mouth as she splashed. To her surprise, it didn't taste like salt water, nor did it taste like water for that matter either. It was just simply wet. Then, to her surprise, she saw something on the horizon. It looked to be a small island. The sight of it confused her. It dominated the horizon line as if she was only a couple 100 meters away, but it couldn't be this close now. There was no sign of it when she looked around only a couple of seconds ago. There were no clouds or waves it could have been hiding behind either. She had no time to think it over. She felt something brush up against her foot again. This time, she could tell what it was. or at least what it felt like. It felt like human skin. It made no sense to her, but she didn't plan on sticking around long enough to find out. She hurriedly paddled her way over to the island, kicking her feet frantically. As she got closer to the island, she could hear sounds. However, they weren't sounds that she would expect to hear in this environment. They weren't waves or sea life, but rather spoken words. They sounded dim and muffled, and she couldn't make out what they were saying. Also, the words sounded like they were right in her ears, even though there was nobody around. Eventually, she could make out the words that were being said, but they made no sense. "Do you think she's doing okay? Here, Jesse and Tyler, help me get her off the floor and onto the desk at least. Do you feel her, Alexandria?" "Not really feel her, but for some reason I can't stop thinking about her. This whole thing is stupid. How the fuck are we going to drive them out of the city with these useless powers?" The entire conversation from multiple voices she was sure she recognized continued to play on as she swam to the island. It was as if she were in the room with them, but there was no sign of anyone on the water, nor anybody on the coast of the island. She was about to call out to the island to make sure, when she felt her body rise in the water on the crest of a wave. Only, it wasn't a wave. Something large had burst out of the surface of the water. What it was, she wouldn't dare look behind her. Her gaze was instead transfixed on its shadow. The shadow was long and continued to extend. It not only engulfed Sophia, but also the entire island, and continued to extend past the island endlessly. She clenched her eyes shut, preparing for some impact, but there was nothing. The shadow was still there, but the water was unnaturally calm again. She turned around in the water and opened her eyes. It was an arm, a human arm. The skin on the arm was dark, smooth, and it looked to be female. Even though she had been caught on the wave as it burst through the surface, it was on the horizon line, looking to be hundreds of meters away from her. The hand was open-palmed, with fingers outstretched, as if reaching for something in the sky. "Hey, I think I can feel her, guys." The arm suddenly started to fall down in Sophia's direction. As it fell, it seemed to extend towards her, lengthening the arm beyond normal proportions. Where at first it looked like it wouldn't fall anywhere near her, now it looked like it was coming down right on top of her. She screamed in abject terror and shut her eyes again as it came crashing down on top of her. She put her body into the fetal position as it went rocketing down into the depths. She had the sensation of being pulled and pushed around violently, as if in a riptide. All she could do was duck her head into her knees and try to brace for impact. She felt her body hurtle down into the depths, not knowing when she would hit the ocean floor. Strangely, she couldn't feel any water resistance as she fell. It felt as if she were falling through air. Finally, her body hit the floor of the ocean. She stayed in the fetal position, anticipating another impact. However, there was none. She lifted her head to see only darkness all around her. There was a faint light illuminating her body, as if it were emanating from it. However, the faint glow only emitted a couple of inches in front of her. She uncurled her body and turned around in every direction, scanning for any signs of life. It was at this time that she realized she wasn't choking in the water. It wasn't that she couldn't breathe underwater, she just simply didn't need to breathe. Strangely, she felt that the ground beneath her feet was soft. Looking down, she saw that the ocean floor didn't resemble any ocean floor she had ever seen. It wasn't made of sand or silt like one would expect. Instead, it looked to be made of a mass that sank under weight. Upon closer inspection, she saw veins crossing across the floor like it was made of flesh. Transfixed by the sight, she bent down and placed her hand on the surface. The moment she did, she felt the ground writhe beneath her. At the same time, the ground started to illuminate in a faint white glow in all directions. The glow and activity remained even as she released her hands. That was when she felt the presence again behind her. It was impossibly large, and she could sense its presence even though she couldn't see it. She was nothing but an ant to whatever it was. In terror, she swam in the opposite direction from it. Her body propelled itself faster than any human could swim, but it didn't feel like it was enough. The presence was still there. As she looked behind her for any trace of what was after her, her body collided with a wall. It wasn't made out of rock, but again, felt like it was made of flesh. Not even bothering to look at what it was, she sped off in another direction. However, she collided with the fleshy wall again after only a couple of seconds. Over and over again, she sped off in different directions, only to be met by the same wall. To her horror, the distance between the walls was shrinking, as if they were closing in on her. It was then that she finally took a look at the wall illuminated by her faint glow. The wall was ridged with deep wrinkles crisscrossing all along it. Fingerprints, she thought, as she realized that she was trapped between cupped hands. Suddenly, her body was swept off the ground in a current as the gigantic hands completed the trap and cupped her against the palms. As she settled down, she was now resting on the hands. Before she could escape, they rose upwards with such forces that she was pressed against the palms by the force. The glow that they had been emitting from the ground disappeared as she rocketed upwards, leaving her in complete darkness again. Then, just as she started moving, she came to a halt. The cupped palms opened up, but no light was present still, with her glow being the only source of light. She felt the presence was right in front of her. Then she felt it start to close again. Now that the hands brought her up to its level, whatever this thing was now bringing its head down to its hands. The first thing she saw in her glow was a dark hemisphere, lower down, as if in a reverse sunrise. The chin, she thought to herself. It continued to fall, revealing a large crevice that slashed across in either direction for what looked like meters. The mouth. Each end of the mouth was curved upwards. Whatever it was happy to have caught her. The mouth passed out of view below the palms as she was almost struck by a fleshy outcropping that brushed against the palms she was resting on. This was its nose. She dreaded what she knew was coming next. The fleshy outcropping gave way to reveal a pit. She knew that it was the socket, but she couldn't see the eye yet. As it bent closer, she was flung back by a wave of water pressure as it blinked. As the water cleared, she looked up and was shocked to see herself. After a couple of seconds, she realized that she was looking at her reflection. Backing up, she knew that its eye was looking at her. She felt a sense of vulnerability, as if it could see within her. That was when she felt the ground tilt underneath her. She was flung to the ground as the palms were tilting upwards to the pupil of the eye. She tried to swim out of the way, but she could no longer move. The pupil was expanding as she slid closer to it. In desperation, she tried clinging to the ground, but there was nothing to grip onto. There was a split second as the palms lifted to their zenith, and then she fell into the abyss of its eye. My friend walked into the water. I never saw him again. By TheAtlasOdyssey. Children can often be cruel. A kid picks up a toy and suddenly her hair is being pulled. She accidentally chose the wrong toy, one which was already claimed by someone else. In a sense, they're very territorial little creatures. Some researchers theorize that it's an evolutionary trait. Figure out where you belong in the pecking order early. I don't know exactly how a green toy tractor would be beneficial for one's survival, even if it's a perfect replica of a John Deere. Something about projecting parts of yourself onto inanimate objects and therefore extending your survival to that of the object, I guess. I have a fair amount of experience in this department. I grew up in a world without sound. Even if my condition was invisible to the naked eye, draping me like a ghost made out of thick blankets, the other kids knew. Of course they did. This made me a very easy target. Early, my parents made sure to give me all the tools I would need to take on the world. Sadly, it wasn't really enough. One would think being deaf is a shield from the words of others, but words are never the worst part. Disgusted looks after I miss a cue during PE, being omitted from the band class even though I loved the feeling of guitar strings against my fingertips, teachers not bothering putting subtitles on during movie time. Those were the worst parts. The day I met Anton was cold. I remember dragging my feet towards school. Brown puddles were scattered on the pavement and my previously white shoes soaked up the water a little too well to be made out of leather. As I arrived, the bell rang. Walking slowly, dreading another day of ableism, I noticed a red-haired boy sitting by his lonesome, under the bleachers, next to the football pitch. Something about him gave me an impression of inherent kindness. I don't know what gave me the courage to actually be the conversational instigator. Probably the freckles. "I'm Sarah." He gently mouthed something back. After that, we spent a lot of time together. At the start, we would wait for the other kids to finish playing their games before swooping in afterwards when no one was around. Two silent, stealthy ninjas on their quest for world domination through hopscotch and basketball. Anton picked up sign language quickly, and suddenly I had someone who wasn't of my blood to talk to. However, so did my tormentors. Apparently, teenagers are cruel too, and they're more determined. Soon I had heard, pun intended, every insult in the book. But when the words got vile, I would follow the advice Anton gave me. "Close your eyes. That's your superpower," he would sign. Now, I think I've made it clear how much this person means to me, and why it hurts so fucking much to think about his fate. Fuck. In university, we both picked up hiking together. The scenery in Sweden is absolutely breathtaking if you know where to look. Anton's favourite part about nature were the sounds, mine the smells. I remember that morning in vivid detail. We woke up in the same tent just before the gilded rays of the sun pierced the trees of the coppice. Small particles of pine aroma made their way to my nose, yelling at me, no, screaming that they were ready to reproduce. "Get off your phone." I had to repeat the signs 3 times before I got his attention. "Fine. Not many gay dudes on Tinder in homophobe city anyways," he replied, referring to the near backwater town where we stayed. We did what we usually did, started wandering in the forest aimlessly, enjoying the many impressions the forest offered. Every time a squirrel scuttered up an oak tree or we spotted a plant we'd never seen before, we'd stop. I could mistake these small moments for anomalies in the space-time continuum. They seemed to last just a bit longer than all the unpleasant ones. I was inspecting a particularly cool rock, probably some kind of granite, when I noticed Anton stop moving on the spot. This was indicative of something I could never experience. He was listening for, or to, something. It kind of looked like he was in a trance of some sort. I made it a game to try and guess what bird had him that enchanted. I made a noise to get his attention, but it was futile. In the end, I just walked up right in front of him. "Is it a blackbird?" is a violin." At first I thought it was a nickname I didn't recognize for one of the local species, so I made him clarify. "No, someone is playing the violin," his hands told me. Eventually he was moving towards the sound, or so I assumed. I kept asking him questions, but he wouldn't stop, answering in few words. Magnificent, stunning, almost magical. We entered a small grove. A tiny lake placed in the middle was the centerpiece, and on the water there was a rock. On that rock sat a man, hunched over, completely naked, with a violin and bow. There was something off about the way he was positioned, almost like he had been waiting for a long time, as if he, or it, could hear my thoughts. He stood up and straightened himself. I'm not going to lie to you. He was beautiful. Long blonde hair falling down his chiseled body, which was almost glistening in the sun. I would call him the epitome of beauty, but his smile was crooked. Something wasn't right. Anton had stopped to take in the scene, but was soon on his way towards the man. I began to calmly ask him to stop, walking backwards in front of him. Soon, my gestures were getting more and more frantic as I realized he wouldn't slow down. He had stopped responding to me and seemed completely enthralled with the music the man on the lake was playing. Anton was much stronger than me, so I could never physically stop him in normal circumstances if he set his mind to something. But now, I couldn't even slow him down. It was as if he turned into a machine, dead set on reaching his destination. I started shouting, I think. He would just glance at me with content eyes. Not even when he set foot in the water would he flinch. I started screaming at the man to stop the music, but he just looked at me with dead eyes. He wasn't so pretty anymore. A subtle desperation had entered his expression, and as Anton moved further into the pond, he licked his lips. I felt this awful feeling, like that thing carried a hunger so intense it could only be described as starvation. I let go of Anton's arm and started crying. The man would just look at me, then back at my friend, brandishing an awful smile. I didn't stop crying until Anton's shoulders disappeared, then his head. The pond was deeper than I thought possible, and soon I could barely make out the shadow of the submerged Anton. I tried going after him, but he was determined to keep sinking. Soon I got lightheaded and swam back upwards. Before I breached the surface, I looked down, and the last I saw of him was his kind eyes and gentle smile. I felt like he wanted to tell me something. Just close your eyes. I gasped for breath. I started making my way back to the shore. Dripping wet, I sat down in the warm grass. The man on the rock looked at me with a certain confusion. I started screaming at him. I don't think I used any discernible words, angry sounds, primal sounds. He just looked at me. The confusion was gone. Now he just looked smug, and he started to change. The colour of his skin started draining. Soon, the perfectly bronzed skin was more akin to the greys of boiled chicken. His limbs started elongating to lengths deeply unnatural. His smile grew from something lightly wicked to something nightmarish. Weirdly, I couldn't see the increments of the transformation, yet he transformed nonetheless. The end result was fucking terrifying. I couldn't move. It stared at me with large, oval black eyes. Earlier, I mused on the fact that pleasant moments seemed to last longer than unpleasant ones. But this was different. It felt like forever. Then it slowly raised a thin, sickly arm and waved a slow goodbye. The audacity of this fucking thing. It crouched and started climbing down the rock at the pace of a sloth, never breaking eye contact with me. When it broke the surface of the pond, it did so quietly, I could tell. The water barely moved, and then it was gone, along with Anton. I had to get this off my chest, and now people will know where I went. Even if that thing still occupies the darkest corners of my nightmares, the forest seems to be calling me. Even though my lungs got damaged to a point of permanent remembrance, I dream of the fluttering water. Even though I can't hear his music, I feel something tugging at my sleeves. I imagine the water was a component of something far more sinister, something ancient. The beauty of it, however, is that I won't have to be wary of every crevice, nook and cranny on my crusade. I know where it will be, on that same rock, in that same lake, hunching over that same terrible fiddle. I thought I was lucky to survive the crash. I was wrong. By horror writer 1717. I looked out the window as the sun set over an endless sea of clouds floating below, looking every bit like I was sailing on my way to heaven. But inside the plane was a different story. I was sitting in premium economy class. Translation: the cattle car with around an inch of extra legroom. As I glanced longingly up the aisle toward the first class section, a man who looked like he weighed easily 350, if not 400 pounds, plopped into the seat beside me. I say plopped, but it was more of a struggle than that. It was like watching someone trying to shove a beach ball into a balloon. When he finally squeezed his way into the seat, he looked at me and smiled sheepishly. I'm sure he was embarrassed, just as I was sure that I would regret having the window seat when the horrible time came that I had to go to the bathroom. I thought they had a weight limit for passengers. I suppose when you buy cheap seats, you get what you pay for. I tried to get the company to spring for first class, but they wouldn't hear of it. Premium economy was as high as they would go. I guess I see where their top salesman ranks. Okay, maybe not the top salesman, but I do sell some. Anyway, I tried to settle in beside my new best buddy, whom in my mind I affectionately labelled the blimp. This was going to be the longest 9-hour flight of my life. I spent the first hour trying in vain to get some work done on my laptop. That's when my bladder betrayed me. I tried to ignore it and keep working for another half hour, but then it was time. I got an emergency notice from down below. Go to the bathroom or go in your pants. I surrendered and began the long process of trying to wake the blimp. I nudged him, then pushed him, then pinched him. Finally, he roused from his slumber like a sleeping dragon. Are we there already? He said, yawning. No, sorry, I have to use the restroom, I said. He looked at me as if I'd just asked him to skip the next several meals. Can't you hold it? He said. My mind ran through an entire list of expletives and derogatory remarks that I would have loved to answer with, but in the end, I went with the one most likely not to get me eaten when I eventually tried to sleep. No, I can't hold it for another 7+ hours, I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. He grunted and began the long extrication process as my bladder screamed for mercy. Finally, he stood and stepped into the aisle, knocking the hat off the person sitting in front of us. Watch it, bud, the man said. The blimp stepped aside and pointed at me as I tried to get around him to rush back toward the restrooms. Both doors said, occupied. I tried the first door just to be sure. Someone's in here, a woman's voice sing-songed. I tried the second one. Can't you read? Came an irritated voice from inside the room. It's occupied. I stood there and endured the pain of an overfull bladder, having no other choice. I looked around to see if there was a garbage can with an empty soda bottle, but there wasn't. Just when I was sure my bladder was about to explode, I heard the latch open and a large man stepped out of the bathroom. He glared at me. "You got a problem with letting people use the John in peace?" "Nope," I said as I dodged past him and into the bathroom. I whipped around and latched the door. "Hey," the man said from the other side. "I wasn't done talking to you." I ignored him as he pounded on the door. I was too busy relieving myself to pay attention until I heard, "I'll be waiting out here for you." Great, I thought. Now some big old good old boy wants to kick my butt. I finished and was about to flush when I paused instead. Maybe I can wait him out. I put the seat down and sat. After a while, I looked at my watch and it had been 10 minutes. Surely he'd be gone by now. I reached for the latch when I heard the other door open. "Excuse me, ma'am," I heard him say as the woman in the other bathroom walked by. He was waiting, and I was sure it wasn't to say that he understood my urgency and wanted to apologize for taking so long. I sat back down and contemplated my options. A. Sit here for the rest of the flight. B. Go and get my butt kicked. I didn't like either option. The plane suddenly rocked so hard I was thrown against the wall. I saw stars. It took me a minute to recover and stand to go see what had happened when I was thrown against the wall again. This time I nearly lost consciousness. I cautiously reached for the door handle when the third time was the charm. I hit the wall and the lights went out. I woke to cold water slapping me in the face. I thought I had fallen asleep and the stewardess was waking me up. The reality was so much worse. There was water in the room. I'm not talking about a puddle on the floor. I'm talking about water halfway to the ceiling. I had my own pool for the first time in my life. Instant panic set in. Had the water pipe burst? Had I bumped the sink before I went unconscious and flooded the room? I didn't want to be responsible for the carpet cleaning costs. I reached for the door and tried to open it, but it was stuck. Was the big guy leaning against it, trying to teach me a lesson about being impatient? I pushed again and it gave a little. I planted my feet against the toilet and shoved with all my might. Finally, the door came open. My worst nightmare couldn't be as bad as what I saw. There was water everywhere. The seats were covered and there was only a few feet of open air from the top of the seats to the ceiling of the plane. I saw heads bobbing above the water. I sloshed through and saw people still in their seatbelts, unconscious. I unfastened those closest to me and saw they had life preservers around their necks. I looked for one myself. I glanced over and there was the blimp, still fastened to his seat, not moving. I shook him, but he didn't respond. I unfastened his seatbelt, but he was wedged in and I couldn't get float out. I struggled to release him but realized he hadn't moved the entire time. I checked for a pulse, but he was gone. I pulled the life preserver over his head and put it on my own. I looked up the aisle and saw many more heads bobbing. I also saw the water had risen. Panic gripped me and told me I was about to drown. I started swimming my way towards the front, hoping to find the emergency exit. On the way, I unlatched as many seatbelts as I could. All the passengers looked like they were unconscious, but just in case. I made it to the emergency door and tried to open it. It was harder to open than the bathroom door. I pushed with all my might and it barely budged. I wished I had the big, angry guy with me right about now, but I was the only one I'd seen moving. A few of the passengers I'd released floated towards me, but their eyes remained closed. For what seemed like hours, I struggled to open the emergency door to no avail. I pushed to take a breather when I heard a horrible sound. It was like a screeching and stretching of something inhuman, like a monster in its death throes. I looked around, trying to find the source of this horrible sound, when I noticed the ceiling had begun to split apart above me. The screeching sound got louder as the water level rose. The front and back of the plane seemed to be taking on more water, and I was standing right in the middle. The water level rose as the crack grew, and my feet no longer touched the floor. The water had risen so high that my life preserver was floating me up towards the ceiling. The problem was, the ceiling was full of jagged edges waiting to rip me to shreds. I rose, unable to stay down, going straight towards the sharp metal and plastic. Suddenly, the plane ripped in two, pulling the edges of the two sides away from me and shooting me up to the surface of the water, while the plane was dragged towards the bottom of the ocean. I bobbed up and down on the ocean waves, made worse by the displacement of water from a huge passenger plane. I looked around, but it was dark, and all I could see were stars and a thumbnail moon. I swished the water with my hand, moving in a circle, but I couldn't see anything. The sea was pitch black, with only a shimmer of moonlight reflecting off it. I focused on the shimmer, hoping to see something. A boat, a buoy, anything that might be in the water that could rescue me. After a while, I was about to give up when I saw something pass through the shimmer. It wasn't there for long, and it wasn't very far from me. I started swimming towards it when a terrible thought struck me. What if it was a shark? I stopped swimming and stayed as still as possible. My blood froze, even though the water wasn't that cold. I had no idea where I was or where anyone else was, and I had no desire to become a snack. All these thoughts raced through my mind, making me want to jump out of the water and run towards land, cartoon style, when I felt something touch my leg. My body involuntarily made use of the endless bathroom I was floating in. I didn't move. I used every ounce of determination, fueled by sheer terror, to stay as still as possible. I waited for an eternity. Nothing happened. Just as I was about to breathe a sigh of relief, something touched me again. It was toying with me, tenderizing me, waiting for me to lose it and start thrashing around so it could enjoy its meal. It bumped me again, this time on my head. Wait a minute, I thought. Sharks don't jump out of the water to get what's already in their reach. I took a deep breath and turned around to see what had been touching me. It was a fellow passenger floating with their life preserver. In fact, it was the man who had been in the bathroom. I breathed a sigh of relief. "So you made it too," I said. The man stared at me silently. "You're not still mad at me for that silly bathroom thing, are you?" I said. He refused to speak. "Let it go, man," I said. "Be happy we made it through this." His eyes penetrated mine. "Fine. Be mad if you want." Then he turned his eyes away from me and stared off into the distance. "What?" I said. "What do you see? What's out there?" I turned and scanned the horizon to see what he had spotted. As hard as I looked, I didn't see a thing. "What did you—" I trailed off. He was gone. I was once again alone in a sea of darkness. I questioned if he'd ever been there at all. What was happening to me? Was I losing my mind? As I questioned my sanity, I heard something off in the distance. I listened for a long time before I heard it again. It was a whistle. Not like someone whistling a tune, but like a plastic whistle someone would use to call for help. This stirred a memory. I looked down at my life preserver, and sure enough, there was a plastic whistle attached to it. I pulled it free and began blowing it in answer. After several loud blasts, I waited. There was a whistle in the air. I began swimming toward where I had heard the sound. After a few minutes, I stopped to rest and blew my whistle again. When the return whistle came, I was surprised to find the sound didn't come from right in front of me, but off to my right. I must have gotten turned around somehow. I started swimming in the direction of the sound and stopped to blow my whistle. Once again, the answering whistle didn't come from in front of me, but off to the left, almost behind me. Am I swimming too hard and going right past them? I decided to stay still for a few minutes and then blow my whistle. When the answer came, it was in a completely different spot. I tried to test my theory that it wasn't me that was moving. I stared in the direction of the last whistle and waited for a minute. When the answering call came this time, it was behind me. The stranger thing was, it seemed like no matter what I did, the whistle never got any closer or any farther away. I was getting creeped out. I stopped whistling. After a while, I heard the whistle again, this time from in front of me. I refused to move or answer. After a while, I heard it again, still in front of me. There was no doubt in my mind, someone was playing games. My first and most obvious guess was the guy from the bathroom. He seemed like the kind to play games on someone. But would he go further? As far as I knew, we were in the ocean alone. I had no idea how many people had made it out of the plane, but I was sure the guy wouldn't have been able to convince them all to play along with his stupid little game when they were fearing for their lives. The darkness began to fade as the first vestiges of light fought against it, turning the sky steel grey. The light brought me hope and would also bring me answers. The sky could hide and play games in the dark, but the light would reveal his deception. As the grey sky turned lighter and gave way to orange, then bright yellow, I saw dots all around on the surface of the water. I swam toward one and found it was another passenger. "Glad to see you made it," I said. I was indisposed at the time. "Any idea what happened?" The woman looked back at me with empty eyes. "Hello?" I said, waving my hand in front of her face and snapping my fingers. She didn't respond. I reached over and felt her neck for a pulse, waiting to be slapped for being so forward. But the only slap I received was reality. She had no pulse. She was dead. I felt helpless. I wanted to say something, to do something, but there was nothing to be done. The woman slowly floated away from me. I looked around and saw several others bobbing on the water. There were at least a dozen. "Hello?" I called out. "Is anyone else alive?" My eyes searched the faces one by one, looking for any sign of a response, but I found none. Hopelessness turned to determination. There was something I could do. I could check these people to see if they were sleeping or... I swam to the closest one and checked for a pulse. Nothing. I swam to the next, and again nothing. When I got done checking those I'd seen first, a few more popped up a little further away that I must have missed. I checked them all. Until I was done, I had discovered 32 people who had managed to get out of their seatbelts, only to perish some other way. The strange thing was, I didn't notice any obvious injuries. There were no head wounds that I saw and no cloud of blood circling any of them. It was like they just gave up. I checked the last body and to my astonishment, it was the man from the bathroom, the same one who had bumped into me last night. Had he been alive then? I thought so. But the more I replayed our encounter, the less I believed he'd been alive. More than likely, he just happened to bump into me as his dead body floated in the water. As I was pondering this, I saw another body. I swam over to check it and then stopped cold. I recognized this guy. It was someone I had checked already, but that was impossible. I had checked him over a dozen bodies ago. Had I gone in a circle? Everywhere I looked there was nothing but water. With no frame of reference and no land, I could have gotten turned around. And then I looked up. The sun was high in the sky. Once it started going down, I would have the ultimate reference. I couldn't possibly lose the sun. Then I saw the dark clouds on the horizon, reminding me how wrong I was. I hoped and wished and prayed for them to turn and go in another direction, but they didn't. Slowly, they approached like a blanket of doom. As I watched the approaching clouds, one of the people near me suddenly disappeared under the water. My eyes grew wide at this apparition. They didn't slip out of their life preserver, it would have stayed on the surface. I was fairly sure it wasn't my imagination, but after these last few hours, I wasn't 100% sure of anything. I had to entertain the idea that I might be slipping into madness. I couldn't remember the last time I had eaten or drank anything, and I was sure that I had swallowed minuscule amounts of seawater since the crash. Come to think of it, I had been feeling lethargic. I'm pretty sure that is one of the signs of seawater poisoning. Or it could be the fact that I hadn't slept in who knows how long. As these thoughts rolled through my mind, the passenger popped back up. He looked the same, but his head was tilting to the side a little. I wondered if I was just imagining it when I saw the water around him was tinged with red. It reminded me of that scene in Jaws when the sheriff sees the first shark attack with his own eyes and the camera zoomed in on his shocked and horrified face. That's how I felt at that moment. Only, I wasn't watching a movie. The danger was real, and it was swimming right beside me. I looked around and spotted the first fin cruising ominously along the water among the bodies. It went under the water and soon another passenger dipped out of sight. She returned a few minutes later, also with her head listing on its side and a red tinge to the water surrounding her. The shark must have eaten part or most of their legs, disturbing the balance of the body that held them up straight. Panic consumed me. I tried to stay as still as possible, knowing that sharks are attracted to movement. Every fact from Shark Week I had ever watched rushed through my head. I turned as slowly as panic would allow, trying to keep track of the shark, when I caught a sight of another fin, and another. With blood in the water, there was no doubt it would become a feeding frenzy. I wallowed in desperation when I heard the whistle again, off in the distance. This time, it was no long, mournful note. It was sharp, panicked blasts. I started swimming towards the whistle, slowly, trying not to make too much splash. The benefit was I was swimming away from where the sharks were feeding. I started to feel relieved when I heard another salvo of whistles. It struck me how they seemed to convey a sense of alarm, even bordering on hysteria. Was I going from proverbial frying pan to fire? Was the mysterious whistler being attacked by sharks too? Or even worse, was there even anyone whistling? I had tried to get close to the whistles earlier, but couldn't, no matter how hard I tried. Was this some trick? Was there some creature luring me to some horrible doom? I'd heard stories of sirens leading men to their deaths. I wasn't sure if I believed such fairy tales or not. Although the longer I attempted to track down the mysterious whistle, the more my mind opened up to supernatural possibilities. It was almost a moot point. I was so tired, my arms felt like they were encased in concrete. Rescue seemed more unlikely by the moment. I stopped swimming because I desperately needed a break. I turned to look back at the swarm of fins amongst the red water and shreds of life preservers. I hoped I was far enough away from the carnage to escape notice. I turned back to the shock of my life. Off in the distance, I could see something big. Was it an island? My mind screamed with joy, but then reality set in. How would I reach something so far away? My hopes came crashing down. I closed my eyes in despair. Hopelessness threatened to drown me long before the water could. When I opened my eyes, I knew I was dreaming. The island had somehow gotten closer. I rubbed my eyes to make sure I wasn't seeing things. When I opened them, sure enough, the island was even closer. This was it. I had lost my mind. I was delusional, hearing and seeing things that weren't there. I knew then that I was close to death. The island continued to grow larger, coming straight at me. I finally realized the island was a ship. I was saved. The ship continued to grow as it steamed straight towards me. I saw for the first time it was an oil tanker, and it was about to kill me. My savior would be my doom. I resigned myself to the fact that I would survive a plane crash, be tormented by ghostly whistling, avoid being eaten by sharks, only to be run over by a ship that could save me. As a tear rolled down my cheek, I was deafened by a loud blast. The horns on the ship blew and I saw it begin to turn away from me. Even better, instead of dying, the ship would turn away from me without even knowing how close it was to rescuing me. As desperation set in, I noticed the ship was slowing as it turned. Just before it got to me, it stopped. The waves slammed into me, threatening to pull me under. I waited and stared up at the massive side of the ship, looking like it was as tall as a skyscraper. Within minutes, I heard the whine of a smaller boat's engine. A man pulled up beside me in a boat. "Are you all right?" he said. I was so shocked and overjoyed, I couldn't speak. He grabbed me and helped me into the boat. "Hey, are you okay?" he said, looking into my eyes. "Yeah," I managed to whisper, surprised at the raspiness of my voice. "Is there anyone else here?" he said. It took me a moment to think. "I was following a whistle." He looked around, then started the boat off in another direction. Before I knew it, he stopped and pulled someone else out of the water. It was a woman I didn't recognize. He sat her at the far end of the boat. "Are you okay?" he asked her. She looked at him with empty eyes but didn't answer. I could empathize with her. The shock of the last 24 hours must have rendered her mute. I saw the whistle in her hand and I knew she was the one I'd been chasing. "Did you see anyone else?" he asked her. She didn't look at him and said nothing. He hung his head and turned the boat to head back to the ship. When we got there, he hooked the boat onto wires that hung down and shouted up to the deck. The boat started rising. I knew I was finally safe. The woman looked up for the first time. She looked at the man who had rescued us and grinned. There was something wrong with her grin. It was too big. There was no way her mouth could be human. Her teeth grew impossibly long and pointy, and her face turned green. Her clothes melted away into the form of some lizard, fish-looking creature. She dove at the man and sank her teeth into his neck. He screamed as she viciously attacked, ripping and tearing at his face, arms, and chest. It wasn't long until he was nothing but a bloody lump of flesh. She turned to me and dove. Watching him be torn apart had given me a moment to acknowledge what had happened. I focused all my energy on one desperate plan. As she dove toward me, I kicked with all I had. My foot impacted her on the face and changed her direction. Instead of diving at me, the kick turned her and she sailed over the edge of the rising boat. I listened to the inhumane shriek as it fell all the way down to the water. I laid back in the boat, exhausted, mentally and physically. I opened my eyes when I felt the boat lurch to a stop. The crewmen looked into the boat and recoiled as they saw the remains of their crewmate laying next to me. They backed away and called for the captain. Once he arrived and surveyed the scene, he ordered me taken to a room and cleaned up, and the remains to be removed. It was some time later, after I had slept, that there came a knock at my door. The captain came in and sat down beside my bed. "Have you gotten some rest?" he said. "Yes, thank you," I said. "And thank you for rescuing me." "Unfortunately, you can no longer thank the person responsible for your rescue." "I don't understand." "The man who came down in the boat is the one who spotted you in the water and called for the ship to stop." "Oh. Would you like to tell me what happened?" I sighed deeply. "Where would you like me to start?" "The beginning is a good place." I found a journal washed ashore at the beach. What I read will give me nightmares for the rest of my life. By J.L. Goodwin, 1990. I'm someone who loves to take long walks on the beach in the early mornings, when very little to nobody else is there. The sea spray on my face and the salt air in my nostrils always help make the 8-hour shifts I spend behind a desk somewhat tolerable. And the sight of the sun rising out on the misty waves has always filled me with a sense of calm. However, that changed yesterday when I was out for my walk. It was a slightly rougher day. The waves were crashing on the shore a bit harder than normal, and the wind was whipping something fierce. As I strode along the beach, I noticed something out of place being pummeled around in the surf, like it was a pinball. When I drew closer, I saw it was a plastic bag which had been sealed with duct tape at the top. Inside was what looked like a book of some sort, and driven by curiosity, I waded into the waves up to my ankles to retrieve it. When I got back to my car, I managed to open the bag and found that the book was actually somebody's journal, as stated by the inscription on the inside of the cover. It declared that it belonged to a man named Anthony Hodgson as part of an ocean crossing sailing trip from almost 20 years ago. As I was late for work, I didn't read any more of it, and instead tucked it into my briefcase for safekeeping. I figured I could find out more information later on that night and try and return it to its rightful owner. When I got home that night, I immediately took the journal out and began reading excitedly. However, as I got further and further towards the last entry, my intrigue and excitement crumbled to dust, and it was replaced by some of the strongest dread and horror I have ever felt. I wasn't sure what to do with it once I finished reading. There's not much I can do. I can't send it to anyone, and if I turned it over to any newspaper or TV station, I'm sure it would be dismissed as a hoax. Finally, I decided that the only place I could come to share it would be on here, as I know many others come to share what they've seen and found. Let me know what your guys' thoughts are on this. But for me personally, what I've read has given me some of the worst nightmares I've had since I was a child, and will probably keep me out of the ocean forever. Here are the entries. July 15th, 2004, 3:34 p.m. Well, here we are, journal. Today is the day I've been dreaming about for most of my life. Ever since I was a little child, spending time at my aunt and uncle's house in Maine, reading their old sailing magazines, I've always had the desire to make an oceanic crossing, using nothing more than my skill, knowledge, and determination to get me to the other side. After almost 30 years of waiting, it's now finally my turn. And thanks in no small part to the group of friends I've forged in this journey called life. All in total, there are 6 of us who will be making this trip. Myself, Daryl, Xander, Winston, Holly, and Anastasia. It was Xander's idea for us to begin saving and pooling together our money to purchase a sailboat over 12 years ago. And now, I sit in my cabin on what took what seems like an eternity to attain. Her name is the Lunging Lion, a 52-foot Sparkman & Stevens yawl from 1950, and God, is she one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. And for something almost 55 years old, she looks as good as the day she first entered the water. We're currently docked at a pier in Boston, and I can hear the others loading the final crates of supplies and barrels of diesel fuel on board. Tomorrow, we will sail at the crack of dawn from here, with our bows squarely aimed for none other than jolly old England. I've done the calculations, and if we can average between 10 to 15 knots with the wind, it should be no more than a week and change to make it there. Almost 3,000 nautical miles of the Atlantic lie between us and the end of our journey that we will remember for the rest of our lives. I would love to keep writing, maybe even wax a bit poetic about this undertaking, but I can hear the others calling to me to help them, so this is where I have to end this entry. For a first one, and as someone who's never written in one of these things, I don't think it was that bad. Write later. July 16th, 2004, 11:17 a.m. Good morning, journal. We are officially on our way. We woke up at just a little after 6 in the morning, and after a few consultations of our charts and farewells with the harbour master, we cast off our lines and used the diesel engine to motor out of Boston Harbour. Once we were clear of the last marker buoy, we killed it and opened up the sails. I'm happy to report that the second they did, the wind blowing from the west caught them and we shot off like a bullet from a gun. Currently, according to the readout, we're sailing along at a pleasant 9 knots. Not what we were hoping for, but still adequate. I do have to say though, there is an extreme, almost sense of peace already. Boston and all the rest of the land is slowly but steadily turning into just a thin line behind us. And with the lunging lion under only sail power, the only sound that can be heard are the creaking of the boat's wooden hull as she slices through the water, the sails and the rigging as they are slapped by the wind, and the cries of the seabirds as they follow us out to sea. And, of course, the shouts and laughs of my friends and I. Everyone's spirits are at a crescendo as the object of many late-night conversations turns from the stuff of drunken speculation into reality. I should point out that everyone on board has a job to do. Daryl and Winston are the two with the most practical knowledge on sailing, as they've actually sailed from Washington State down to Baja 4 or 5 years ago as part of a competition. They'll serve as the captain and the navigator for our trip. Thank God for them, or we'd be in way over our heads here. Xander and myself have some knowledge, but only from small trips, usually from Portsmouth up to Bar Harbor in Maine, so we are able to help with piloting, while Holly and Anastasia will be working the rigging, raising and lowering the sails as needed, with our help, of course. Additionally, Anastasia will be serving as our cook for the duration of the trip, and considering some of the meals she's made, I am all for that. I just took a look at the depth finder mounted just beside the main hatch in the cockpit. According to it, the bottom is already over 3,000 feet below us. I know many other people might find such a revelation scary, but as someone who's loved the sea as long as I can remember, it's thrilling. I can only imagine what strange and wonderful creatures swim and float beneath us in the dark and cold waters, listening to the sounds of our hull creaking, reverberating for miles away, as sound travels farther in water than air. Daryl just asked me to take over the helm for a while, so I'll end this entry here. Right again soon. July 18th, 2004. 1:37 p.m. Well, I can't exactly say good afternoon, as things aren't as smooth sailing, pardon the pun, as I would have liked. You see, we've come across a rather large fog bank, which almost seems to have risen up from the waves and ensnared all in its reach, ourselves included. You can't even see 20 feet in any direction, and whenever a sound is made, it tends to bounce off the fog back to you in a rather sharp echo. We've had to pull some sails down and reduce our speed to 6 knots to be safe. To tell you the truth, journal, it's really rather eerie. It's almost like the entire world has been swallowed up and disappeared, and we're all that's left. Thankfully though, Winston told me that he's seen fog like this before, and that it won't last longer than a few hours. I'm grateful for that, honestly. If it had lasted longer, I feel it might pull on my sanity a little. The magazine articles and photos never showed or spoke about this, and I wish they would. It wouldn't have changed my mind on this trip, but it would have prepared me for what to expect. Something loud just splashed out in the gloom. None of us could see what caused it, but everyone topside heard it. It was only a single splash, one which echoed like the crack of a gunshot in the fog. When I asked Daryl what it could have been, he shrugged his shoulders. "It could have been anything, Tony," he said. Lots of things splash around in deep water. Could have been a whale breaching, could have been a shark going after a school of fish. Hell, could have even been a piece of flotsam getting tossed about by a particularly tall whitecap. The explanation brought me more comfort. Instead of a sense of unease about the unknown, my mind is now filled with natural explanations. According to the radar, we're about 400 miles off the coast of the US, and the depth sounder shows the bottom has dropped away to 6,000 feet. We all need to keep a sharp eye out, so I'll stop writing for now to help the others. Write again soon. July 19th, 2004, 1:17 AM. What the actual fuck just happened? Not even 4 hours ago, myself, Xander, and Holly laid down to get some sleep, as we've worked out a schedule where we can sleep 3 at a time, changing out during the night to allow the other team to rest. I'd just managed to drift off when I flew out of my bunk onto the floor. It literally felt as if the boat had slammed into another vessel. For a moment, that was my biggest fear. And after checking on the other two down below me, who both had slight bruises from their own unexpected flights, I dashed topside to the sounds of chaos. Winston and Daryl were shouting back and forth to each other in confusion, and I could hear Anastasia moaning somewhere closer to the bow. When I asked what had happened, they told me they didn't know. It was like we sailed straight into a damn block of concrete, Winston exclaimed to me. When I went to check on Anastasia, I found her lying on her back on the deck. She'd cracked her head on the main mast, giving her a rather nasty bump on her left temple, and received a cut on her cheek. All three of us carried her down below and laid her down in the forward berth, where Holly is looking after her. She says she'll be okay, but she needs to rest for the rest of the night. I, for the life of me, can't understand what we hit. It could have been a whale or a large piece of wood, but nobody saw anything, and it was a perfectly clear night, something that Daryl tells me will end the night after tomorrow, as a storm is coming our way. And I'm fairly certain that the two most experienced of our crew wouldn't jeopardize us so carelessly. They say they didn't see anything, then I believe them. I've gone back down below to try and catch at least an hour's more rest before I help take over the late night to early morning shift at the helm. According to the charts and radar, we are now about 850 miles off the coast, though I didn't look at the depth sounder this time. One additional thing to note that may not have any meaning, but I'm still going to write it down. There was one strange thing I noticed when I went topside and went to help Anastasia. There was a rather putrid scent in the air, something I couldn't place. If I didn't know any better, I would have said it was ammonia, but we have none on board which could have spilled, so I don't know what to make of it. Probably nothing, but still noting. Anyways, good night. Hopefully no more surprises. July 20th, 2004, 4:37 PM. Good morning, journal. Things happily seem to be more on track today than they have been the last two. I'm currently sitting behind the helm, using my foot to keep it straight as I write. Most of the others have gone below to have dinner, which I'll have myself when they're finished. Someone needs to steer, after all. I'm happy to report that Anastasia is back up and, aside from the bump on her head, seems to be in good spirits. She's currently making clam chowder, a favourite of all of ours. We've picked speed back up to about 11 to 12 knots with a strong tailwind, although earlier it died, causing us to have to tack back and forth before, regrettably, having to fire up the engine to carry us a bit farther. The sound of it was almost heresy out here in the silence, only broken by the wind and the waves. It was worth it, though, as I saw a truly amazing sight about half an hour ago. A sperm whale. It breached out of the water, not more than a half a mile away from us. Seeing that giant black leviathan leaping from the waves is a sight that filled me with joy to tell you. It did so a few more times, seeming to move around in a circle before disappearing below the waves. I've honestly never heard of a sperm whale doing multiple breaches in such a short succession. But there's a first time for everything, I guess. Anyways, I look ahead now, and in the distance I can see the storm clouds on the horizon, lightning occasionally flashing in the dark grey fluff. According to the report we got from a tanker on the ship's radio, it will be a bad one, meaning our initial plan to make it to England in just over a week is going to be extended to just about 2 weeks. Fine by me, as despite our setbacks and problems, I still am thoroughly enjoying this journey. Good Lord, did that just startle me? I heard a loud splashing sound off our stern behind me and swung around. There was nothing there, but it was so close I swear I could feel the water droplets hitting me on the back of the neck. Anyways, Xander's coming up to take over helm duties, so it's time for me to head below and eat. According to the radar, we're now over 1,300 miles out to sea, close to the halfway mark of our trip. The depth sounder says 12,000 feet of water lie between us and the sea floor. Right later. July 21st, 2004, 7:18 a.m. I don't even know where to begin with this entry. I'm honestly lost for words, both in my shock and my grief. I suppose there's no other way to put it other than bluntly, Holly's gone. Last night we sailed into the storm at just a little after 8. The waves and the wind became something fierce, something that I only read when reading novels like The Perfect Storm and The Old Man and the Sea. The waves crashed down on the deck with all the ferocity of a freight train, and the howling of the wind sounded like a banshee screaming into our ears. All of us, save for Anastasia, who was cleaning up dinner dishes in the galley, were topside to keep the lunging line straight and true. But the storm battered about our sailboat like it was a child's plaything in the bath. I don't know how big the swells became, but we would ride up one and almost drop in a 75 or 80 degree angle down in the trough before the next set. The lightning flashed, momentarily illuminating the hell we'd sailed into like it was the middle of daytime, and the thunder boomed and rattled my eardrums. Daryl and I were at the helm, fighting to keep the rudder straight while the others were working the rigging and the sails. Holly was working the rigging underneath the mainsail when it happened. A sudden change of wind slammed into us from the port side, shifting the boat sideways. It also caused the boom to change direction suddenly, swinging across the deck like a charging bull. Xander and Winston managed to duck under it, but Holly didn't. The huge wooden fiberglass projectile caught my friend on the side of the head and shoulders in its arc, and before anyone knew what was happening, she was gone, knocked over the railing and into the churning waves. For a moment, as we panicked and looked around us, I thought I saw her in a flash of lightning, about 15 yards behind the boat, waving her arms and her mouth open in a scream as she bobbed in the waves, kept afloat by her life jacket. But when the next flash came, not even 4 seconds later, I saw nothing. We couldn't turn around in the storm, not unless we wanted to swamp ourselves and sink. We could do nothing but helplessly sail away from our friend. Xander hasn't been able to stop crying. Holly and he were an item, and losing his life partner has destroyed him in a way that I can only imagine. The waves have lessened some since, but our boat has taken major damage. Both the radio and radar have been damaged in the storm, making any kind of call for help impossible, as well as knowing our exact location. To make matters worse, there seems to be something wrong with the propeller for the diesel engine, as when we discovered some tears in the mainsail, we lowered them to repair and continue under engine power, but though the engine roared, we didn't move at all. Daryl says he'll check it out once the storm lets up a little more. For now, all happiness of this trip has flooded out of us. Now it's marked by the loss of one of us. I just honestly want to get to England at this point. We'll write later. July 21st, 2004, 3:13 p.m. The storm finally abated enough for Daryl to check on the prop. As the waves petted out and we seemed to move into the eye of the storm, he donned a pair of flippers and a mask and jumped overboard to inspect it. When he popped his head above the waves, his face bore a look of confusion and worry. Treading water beside the boat, he told us that the prop had been sheared half off by something. The one remaining blade had been bent so that it couldn't turn anymore, but the rest was just gone. I remember his exact words. "I've sailed for 15 years, and I've never seen something like this happen in open water. You usually have to run aground to do damage like that." Unnerved myself, I asked him to come back aboard. As he swam back to the swim ladder on the stern, I swear I saw something below the waves. A shape darker than the rest of the ocean, one that seemed to move on its own power, slowly rising up towards us. Whatever it was, it looked big. I fully admit, when I saw that dark shape, I couldn't help but reach over the transom and grab Daryl by the arm, almost wrenching him out of the water. It's beyond ridiculous, I know, but given our recent events, I feel on edge. Hell, we all do. Now, I sit behind the helm of the cockpit as I watch Anastasia and Xander try to sew up the torn sails. I hope they'll do good progress soon. I want to be out of this area before nightfall. And more unnerving is the fact that the ammonia-like smell is back. This time, Winston smelled it as well, holding his nose and complaining about that god-awful stench. We looked around, but saw nothing. I'm beginning to regret being the one who thought this trip of ours up over a decade and a half ago. Write later. July 21st, 2004, 6:13 p.m. Daryl's gone. What the fuck, what the actual fuck is going on? Just before dusk fell, he came back topside, in one arm holding a waterproof flashlight, in the other a brand new propeller. He told us that he had brought a spare along in case of any emergency, and we felt a wave of relief wash over us that would be able to get moving. The storm wall was fast approaching, and Xander and Anastasia hadn't finished mending the sails yet. He also had a yellow pony bottle, which he pushed the regulator into his mouth, and after picking up a wrench, put on his flippers and mask and slipped back overboard. We all saw his light click on, and he slipped out of sight underneath the boat. Every couple of seconds we saw a burst of bubbles break the surface as he breathed out, and a quick flash of his flashlight swing around. For a few minutes we felt the tension ease up, and despite the grim mood from Holly's death, Winston told us a joke about sharks and a razor-lined surfboard, which made us laugh a bit. But then, that jovial mood deflated as quickly as a bully popping a kid's party balloon. "Hey, what's going on?" we all heard Anastasia cry, and we looked over the railing down into the water. Daryl's light was dancing about as if he was turning rapidly around from one side to the other, the air bubbles coming in faster streams. Then, two things happened in rapid succession. The first was that the beam from his light disappeared. It was as if he had just snapped it off. 1 second it was there, whipping around, the next it was gone. And the second was that a huge stream of bubbles came to the surface at once. It was only for a second, and then nothing. We waited and waited, the seconds drawing into minutes, but our friend and one of our two leaders never resurfaced. It was as if he had never been there. We debated for a few minutes about having someone else go into the water, and after many refusals, I finally relented and grabbed a mask. I wouldn't be going in all the way though. I would just drop down the swim ladder enough to see under the boat, and that was it. As I stepped down and felt the freezing water touch my feet, I felt goose pimples rise all over my arms and legs. I couldn't understand why, but I felt my primal flight or fight instincts kicking in as I stuck my head in the water and shone another flashlight around. I saw no sign of him. The water under the boat was completely empty of life. No fish, no sharks, nothing. And no Daryl. I swung my head around, looking off into the gathering gloom, but still saw nothing. As I turned and looked down into the depths, however, I swear I saw a flash of changing colour. It could have been a trick of the ocean, but I swear I saw one patch turn from a dark blue, almost black, to a very dark maroon. That was enough to make me yank my head out of the water and climb back up from the swim platform. "He's not there," I said to the others. "He's just disappeared." We all agreed then that nobody else would enter the water. We'd take our chances being battered around by the storm. Currently, we've started the bilge pumps before it reaches us. I can hear them roaring away in the recesses of the hull as I sit at the galley table and write this, and I can't help but feel a creeping sense of dread as I close my eyes and recall that dark shape I thought I saw, plus the changing colour I swear I saw in the deep. But I can't let myself lose my cool. We all need to keep a level head if we hope to get back to dry land. I'll write again soon. I hope to God it's with better news. July 23rd, 2004, 2:30 a.m. If you gaze too long into the abyss, you'll find the abyss also gazes back at you. That may not be the exact quote, but who gives a damn? Not when you've looked into the eye of a monster. Still, I should tell what happened. The storm reached us that night, and all throughout it and much of the next day we were battered by it. I thought so many times that the wooden hull would break apart, dropping us into the monstrous waves and stinging rain. But somehow she stayed afloat. It's true what they say. They don't make him like this anymore. As daylight broke, though, the storm increased in its ferocity, and we were forced to venture topside to steer the boat into the waves to keep from capsizing. Myself, Xander, and Winston went up after donning life jackets. We told Anastasia to stay below for her own safety. When we emerged, it was like stepping directly into hell. The rain tore at our faces, and the wind almost completely drowned out the sound of our voices. Lightning pierced the dark, and we worked with our remaining flashlights to raise what little sails we had left, and then began to try and steer towards what our compass and charts indicated was England. We had no idea how far we were from it, or how blown off course the storm had shoved us, but we had to try. For 3 hours we were battered and beaten, but we seemed to make headway. That was when a familiar sensation struck our boat. The same concrete slamming sensation as before, making it feel as if we'd come to a dead stop in the waves, which began to wash hard down into the cockpit. Thankfully the main hatch was closed, so no water got down below. "What the hell did we hit?" I heard Winston shout, to be heard over the howling wind. "Hell if I know," Xander called back to him, and I saw his flashlight beam shine down into the water. "I don't see," his voice cut off. "You don't see what?" Winston yelled back, but there was no answer from him. Feeling a piercing fear seize me, I shone my own flashlight beam up to where he had been, near the bow. It illuminated him, still kneeling and clutching at the railing, staring down into the sea. "Xander, what the hell's the matter with you?" I screamed as loud as I could. Slowly, he turned to look up and back at me. What I saw made me feel as if the blood in my veins had been replaced with ice. I have never seen Xander even a tiny bit afraid before. We always said he was the most courageous out of our group. But now, his face had turned a shade of pale I thought only corpses could hold, and his eyes were about as wide as they could get. His hand holding his flashlight trembled. As I looked, I smelled that putrid stench once more. This time, though, it was overpowering. That was when I heard Winston scream. I swung my beam back portside, and the beam... Oh, God almighty. The beam landed on a scene that, however much longer I am alive, I'll see whenever I close my eyes. Winston was still there, but so was something else, something which had come from the sea itself. My hand trembles as I write this next part. It was a fucking tentacle, an honest-to-God tentacle. It looked like something out of the old 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea movie from the 50s, but unlike that, this was very much alive. I saw every detail in slow motion. The giant club of the tentacle, big enough to wrap around the mast and filled with dozens of huge, wide suckers. The arm of the tentacle, as thick as two men standing next to each other. It all was a dark maroon colour. And then I saw Winston. Oh, God, no. The tentacle had wrapped around my friend with the strength of 7 boa constrictors. Squeezing him so tightly I saw his face turn red, even in the biting wind and rain. He feebly pressed his hands to it, trying in vain to push it away, and then, as quick as one of the bolts of lightning flashed overhead, he was gone. It was so quick I only saw it as a blur, hearing a gigantic splash as he was yanked below the waves. I forgot all about steering the boat and scrambled for the side in some misguided and foolish attempt to save him. I shone the light's beam down to the dark waters, and fuck me running, do I wish I hadn't. Because it shone directly into an eye. An inhuman eye, the size of a wall clock, one which looked back at me with a cold and predatory gaze. The pupil contracted in the light, and it shot back underneath the boat, to the other side. Xander! I turned to scream for my other friend to get away from the railing, but he was already gone. I hadn't even heard him get taken over the wind and the rain. His flashlight rolled around on the deck near where he'd been kneeling, but he was gone. That's when I saw another tentacle rise above the railing, a few feet in front of me. It felt around on the deck, seeming to move by a sense of touch as it searched for its next meal. For me. All courage left me, and I abandoned anything topside and dashed below. I slammed the hatch closed behind me and locked it, knowing full well if it really wanted to, the tentacles could easily rip it off its track. Anastasia was shaking when I ducked down below and saw her. She had been looking through the side windows and seen what had happened to the other two, to Winston, her husband. As much as I was terrified, I went to her. I held her in my arms to console her, and we sat there, sitting on the hardwood floor, listening to the sickening sounds of the tentacles moving underneath us over the hull and breaching the waves to search the deck. After a while, it stopped. The storm lessened a little, the waves ceasing their merciless battering of our boat. Anastasia finally drifted off to sleep in my arms, and I carried her to the forward berth. She needs sleep, so do I, but I can't bring myself to fall asleep. I know I'll be haunted by nightmares of that tentacle and eye. And I know it's still there. I can still smell that ammonia scent, even through the closed windows and hatch. For now, though, I'll just curl up on the galley seats. I don't know what else to do. There's nothing else I can do. Who gives a fuck about the date? This will be my final entry in this journal. I don't even know how many days we've drifted aimlessly on the waves anymore. The storm finally passed, and the waves have remained relatively calm ever since. If it weren't for knowing what lies beneath them, I might almost call it peaceful. It's anything but, though. Our food and fresh water is almost completely used up. All our remaining sails tore in the storm, and Anastasia's in no shape to sew them up. And unfortunately, I never learnt how. It wouldn't matter anyway. Our rudder is gone. I know, because when I opened the main hatch and stuck my head out, I saw it, floating on its side about half a mile away from us, no doubt torn off by that creature, leaving us completely dead in the water. I know what it is now. I was too terrified and confused to put together the pieces in my mind. But now, all the marine biology knowledge in my brain has allowed me to identify it. Archaeoteuthis dux, a giant squid. One far larger than has been seen by scientists before, at least 60 or 70 feet long, judging by the size of the eye I saw. A creature that has for centuries terrorized sailors, giving rise to the legend of the Kraken, pulling ships below the waves and preying upon the floating sailors. So many marine biologists and historians said that the stories of ships being pulled down to their doom were conjecture, wise tales. I can confidently say that they're absolutely full of shit. The stories were right on the money. The lunging lion is slowly sinking. The pumps gave out yesterday. Both Anastasia and I heard them die. When I went topside to check on them, looking around as if I were a fucking owl, making sure I wouldn't be grabbed, and lifted the hatch to the engine compartment, I saw water in it. For a while, we tried bailing it out, but soon gave up. What's the point anyways? We can't call for help. We can't escape in the dinghy lashed to the deck, as we'd be set upon by the beast. That damn smell is always here now, one that signals its presence, along with the scrapes of its tentacles along the hull. We're fucked any way we look at it. And this morning, Anastasia stepped overboard. I don't think she could take the waiting anymore. I awoke just in time to see it. She'd become closed off since the day before, barely saying a word. I couldn't make out what she was thinking. But I awoke and saw the hatch to the cockpit was open. Feeling a new sense of dread course through my veins, I ran to the open hatch, just in time to see her step off the stern railing. I heard the splash of her dropping into the water. The sound of the tentacles rubbing on the hull stopped. And then nothing. Silence. I'm alone now. Well, not completely alone. That fucking thing is still there. The rubbing and scraping has started again. As I write this, the boat has sunk lower into the water. The entire transom is almost underwater, and as it bobs up and down in the waves, I can see it, sitting just below the surface behind the boat and waiting patiently, staring at me with that cold, unblinking eye. It knows as well as I do that I don't have long, which is why I'm going to place this journal in a bag after I'm finished writing this. I'll seal it with a roll of duct tape which floats around near my feet, and then I'll throw it overboard as far as I can. Maybe, with some luck, it'll wash ashore somewhere, so someone can know what happened to us. The transom is lower in the water now, and the tentacles are beginning to reach over the cockpit. I'm going to stuff myself into the forward berth as far as I can and shut the cabin door. If I'm lucky, maybe I'll drown before it can reach me. I don't want to be torn apart by that monster's beak like the others were. Please, whatever you do, beware the open ocean. Monsters, real ones, dwell out here. Goodbye.
There are things worse than sharks in the ocean. By Page Turner 627. Growing up in Wildwood, New Jersey means growing up with sand between your toes and the sound of waves crashing like a lullaby every night. You get used to the seasonal pulse, quiet winters with closed shops and empty streets. Then suddenly, Memorial Day hits and the town explodes with tourists, arcade lights, and that constant smell of boardwalk fries and pizza. Life's not all beach parties and boardwalk games, though. At home, things have been tough. Dad lost his job at the shipyard last winter, and Mum's been pulling double shifts at the diner just to keep us afloat. So when I turned 16, I signed up to be a lifeguard. Not just because I heard girls dig lifeguards, but because the pay was decent and I figured I'd be helping out. Despite being on the swim team since middle school, the training was brutal. The Atlantic isn't your friendly neighbourhood pool. It's wild and unpredictable. Coach drilled us hard on rescues and rough surf, first aid until we could wrap bandages in our sleep, and the dreaded 500-metre swim against the clock. I finished every season with my muscles screaming and my lungs burning, tasting salt on my lips, whether from sweat or the sea, I couldn't tell. Being a lifeguard has its perks. The view from the stand is unbeatable. Miles of ocean, spectacular sunrises, and a front row seat to the world waking up. The community gives respect too. You're seen as a local hero, whether you're rescuing a lost kid or treating a jellyfish sting. Plus, local shop owners often toss free food and drinks our way, a nod to the hard work and long hours we put in on the beach. It's a small town perk that never gets old. Up in the watchtower, I lean back in the creaky wooden chair that's seen better days, my eyes scanning the horizon where the sky meets the sea. It's a slow day, the kind that falls in the lull between the fireworks of July 4th and the last hurrah of Labour Day. The beach isn't deserted, but it's not the wall-to-wall blanket mess of high season either. A few families dot the sand, kids building sandcastles and chasing waves, while a couple of older tourists brave the chilly water with tentative steps. The radio crackles occasionally with chatter from the main station, but mostly it's just the cry of seagulls and the distant laughter of kids. I'm halfway through scanning my usual zone when I hear a voice from behind me.
Hey, Watchtower Dreamer. You saving any lives today or just the flies?
I turn to find Tori Alice leaning against the doorframe with that lopsided grin that's always spelled trouble. Tori, with her sun-bleached hair always tied back in a reckless bun, and the kind of tan lines that tell stories of long summer days spent outdoors. Tori and I have run in the same circles forever, or at least since we both started doggy paddling at the YMCA, though Tori has always been one step ahead. She's just a year older than me, but it feels like more. When I was fumbling through my first awkward swim meet, she was already setting school records. By the time I caught up to join the team, she was the captain. She always seemed just a bit out of reach, always a grade ahead, and in my mind, miles too far. I managed to smile, shaking off the saltwater fog of my daydreams. Just keeping an eye on the horizon, you know, in case the Kraken decides to show up today.
Kraken, huh?
Tori chuckles, the sound bright against the muted backdrop of waves.
Well, if one shows up, I guess we'll just have to wrestle it back into the deep.
Deal, I say with a nod. I can't help but notice the brand new Rutgers University hoodie she's wearing over her lifeguard uniform. It's not the first time I've seen her in it, but today it feels like a glaring reminder that this is her last summer before she heads off to college, leaving this beach, and possibly me, behind. It's a stupid thing to get hung up on, considering she's still right here, but it feels like a billboard for all the things I'm about to miss. I look down, tracing patterns in the weathered wood of the watchtower floor, suddenly feeling the weight of the coming changes. Tori notices the shift in my demeanour, her expression softening just a touch, a silent understanding passing between us. She's always been able to read me like an open book.
What's with the long face, huh? You look like someone just told you summer's cancelled.
Just thinking about stuff, you know. I shrug.
Yeah, I know.
She starts, her voice softening.
Hey, I know exactly what'll cheer you up.
She fishes into the pocket of her hoodie, her movement teasing and slow, building the suspense like she's about to pull out a winning lotto ticket. Instead, she reveals a familiar, crinkly packet of salt water taffies, the kind that stick to your teeth and taste like every childhood summer rolled into one.
Emergency stash,
She declares with a wink, holding the packet out to me. I can't help but smile as she tosses the packet into my lap. What would I do without you?
Starve probably.
She quips, settling down beside me on the creaky chair. The old wood groans under our combined weight.
Or die of boredom. Take your pick, kid.
I roll my eyes, unable to suppress a grin. Kid? Come on, you're only like 12 months older. That doesn't give you ancient wisdom or anything.
12 months is plenty.
She counters, her tone playful yet edgy, with a hint of that so-called adult wisdom.
A lot can happen in a year. You'll see when you hit my old age.
Yeah, like forgetting where you put your dentures, I shoot back. Tori burst out laughing, the sound so carefree it almost makes the day seem brighter. As she laughs, her sunglasses slip slightly, revealing the edge of a black eye, stark against her sun-kissed skin. My stomach tightens as I ask, "Hey, what happened to your eye?" She quickly adjusts her sunglasses back down, a bit too hastily.
Oh, this.
She tries to laugh it off, waving her hand dismissively.
You should see the other guy, right? Just a surfing mishap. Caught a rogue board to the face.
I lean forward, not buying it for a second. Tori, come on. We've known each other since we were kids. I know when you're bullshitting me. She stiffens, the easy smile fading from her face.
Josh, it's nothing, really.
Is he hitting you again? I cut in, my voice low but firm. I've known Tori's dad long enough to suspect the worst. He's the type who smiles in public and lets his fist talk behind closed doors. She bites her lip, her posture stiffening.
Seriously, let's just drop it, okay?
But I'm already past the point of brushing it aside. You shouldn't have to cover up for him, Tori. He's...
Just drop it, Josh.
She cuts me off, her voice sharp, but it breaks on the last word. I ball my fists, feeling helpless, angry. He can't just keep getting away with this. I swear to God I'll...
You'll do what?
Tori interrupts, her voice slicing through my rising fury.
My dad is a deputy mayor. He's got half the police in his pocket. You go stirring things up, and he won't just sit back. He'll have you locked up, or worse.
Her eyes dart around, making sure no one's listening.
I've got 1 more month until I'm out of here. I can manage until then.
I clench the lifeguard tower's old wooden railing, frustration boiling inside me. 1 month of dodging fists? That's 1 month too many, Tori. She shakes her head, the loose strand of her bun fluttering in the salty breeze.
It's not just about me. Think about my mum, my little brother, the fallout. It'll crush them. I can't do that to them. Not when I'm so close to leaving.
Seeing her so resigned, the fight draining out of her, makes my chest tighten. But you can't just... I begin to say, but the words trail off as my lifeguard instincts kick in. I catch something out of the corner of my eye, a disturbance in the water, far offshore. My heart skips as I grab the binoculars hanging by the window, the argument with Tori momentarily forgotten. Peering through the lenses, the ocean comes into sharp focus, and there it is, a solitary figure, arms flailing wildly. They're too far out, way beyond the safety zone where the buoys bob lazily in the swell. My stomach knots as I watch them struggle against the pull of the current, unmistakably drowning. Shit, Tori, there's someone out there, I shout. Tori's by my side in a heartbeat, her own quarrels forgotten as she follows my gaze.
Where?
she asks, squinting into the distance. Directly east from the big rock, about 300 yards out. I hand her the binoculars and start throwing on my rescue gear, a flotation device and first aid kit. My hands are steady despite the pounding in my chest. This is what all those grueling training sessions were for. Tori's already on the radio, calling in the situation to the main tower.
Tower 3 to base. We've got a possible drowning. Far east end past the buoy line. We need backup and an ambulance on standby.
I nod, taking a deep breath as I sling the rescue buoy over my shoulder. We're in action mode now, muscle memory taking over as we haul the old rowboat off its stand and towards the water. The boat's paint is chipped and it creaks a bit too much for comfort, but it's been through more storms than most lifeguards can count. As we drag the boat towards the churning water, I blow my whistle sharply. People scatter, clearing a path straight to the surf. "Keep back! Emergency!" I yell over the roar of the waves. We push it into the surf, the cold Atlantic splashing against our legs, sharp as needles. "On my count," I yell over the roar of the waves, gripping the oars tight. 1, 2, push! The boat lurches forward, cutting through the incoming tide. We jump in, and I take the oars, pulling with all my strength. Tori keeps her eyes fixed on the spot where we last saw the flailing arms, her voice crisp and focused as she guides me. Every row feels like a battle against the ocean, but there's no room for hesitation. The waves are relentless, tossing our little boat like a toy, but I row with everything I've got. My arms are burning, my breath's ragged, but there is a life at stake, and every second counts.
There!
Tori points ahead, her voice urgent. I see it too now, a head bobbing desperately in the water. We're close, so damn close. "Hang on!" I shout to the victim, hoping my voice carries over the waves. As we approach, the scene before us turns grim. The water around the swimmer is a dark crimson colour, spreading out in a sinister cloud. My gut twists at the sight. It's clear he's injured, badly. The oars dig into the water, each stroke a desperate attempt to close the distance between us and the struggling swimmer. But as we draw nearer, a shape breaks through the surface, a dorsal fin, sleek and ominous, cutting through the waves like a knife. Then another and another. My heart drops, ice flooding my veins as we realise what we're up against. "Bull sharks," I mutter under my breath, barely loud enough for Tori to hear, but she does. Her eyes widen, the colour draining from her face. I toss Tori the rescue buoy. She's on her feet in an instant, balancing against the boat's rocking as she leans out to throw the buoy. It lands with a splash right next to the swimmer.
Grab on!
She commands. The swimmer makes no attempt to grab the buoy, which bobs uselessly behind him. Tori's voice cracks as she shouts again, urgency giving way to desperation.
Come on, take it!
But he doesn't respond, doesn't even seem to see it. My stomach churns as I squint through the salt spray, trying to understand why he's ignoring the lifeline we've thrown him. That's when I see it. Something off about his movements. They're too jerky, unnatural. As we draw closer, the truth hits me like a rogue wave. It's not just a swimmer.
What the?
Tori breathes out, her voice trembling. The swimmer has elongated limbs, unnaturally pale skin that almost glows under the sun, and eyes, dark, void-like, that don't reflect any light. As waves lap around him, his form shifts. Less human and more something else. It becomes increasingly clear that there's something profoundly wrong. Where I expected to see legs kicking frantically for survival, there's nothing. The lower half of the figure isn't human at all. It's as though he's merged with something else, something massive and obscured beneath the waves. The sharks, drawn by the blood, begin to circle faster, their movements more frenzied. They dive in, their powerful jaws snapping shut on the figure's pale limbs, tearing away chunks of flesh. Each attack sends a new wave of blood billowing out, darkening the blue water with a thick, ominous red. Tori and I stare, horrified, as the feeding frenzy intensifies. More sharks appear, attracted by the scent of blood, their bodies slicing through the water with ruthless efficiency. One of the larger bulls, easily 8 feet long and solid muscle, slams into our boat. The impact is like a sledgehammer blow, jarring every bone in my body. The old rowboat lurches dangerously to the side, and Tori, unprepared for the sudden movement, stumbles. For a heart-stopping moment, it looks like she's going to fall right into the middle of the bloody fray. "Tori!" I shout, lunging towards her. My hand clamps down on her arm just as her body tips over the side, half in, half out of the boat, dangling dangerously close to the frenzied water. Her eyes are wide, fear etched across her face, but she clings to my arm, her grip as desperate as mine. Pulling with all the strength left in me, I haul her back into the relative safety of the boat. We collapse in a heap, gasping, our breaths harsh against the sound of snapping jaws and splashing water. Tori's face is just inches from mine, and for a split second, the chaos around us dims, drowned out by the pounding of my heart. As we catch our breaths, huddled together in the bobbing boat, a new terror begins to unfold. Below the turmoil of splashing and blood, deeper in the water, a pair of large, glowing orbs start moving towards the surface. They burn coldly in the murky depths, like ghostly lanterns summoning us to the unknown. The sharks, frenzied as they are, seem oblivious, or perhaps indifferent to the deeper menace rising from below.
"Josh?"
Tori whispers, her voice barely audible over the chaos.
"What is that?"
I don't have an answer, not one that makes any sense, but every instinct screams that it's something far worse than sharks. The water around the orbs begins to bubble and froth, a sign that whatever owns those eyes is massive and coming up fast. I don't know, but we can't stick around to find out, I reply. I shove the oars into the water, pulling with more strength than I knew I had. The boat cuts through the waves, each stroke pushing us further from the nightmarish scene unfolding behind us. Tori, with her usual quick thinking, grabs the second set of oars.
"On it."
She says, her tone all business now. Together, we row, our movements synchronized, driven by the urgent need to put as much distance as possible between us and whatever is surfacing. The shape beneath the water grows clearer, its vast size dwarfing our little rowboat. As it rises, the surface of the water bulges ominously, and then, with the gut-wrenching sound of displacement, massive jaws breach the surface. It's lined with rows of serrated teeth, each one big enough to sever limbs with a single bite. The air fills with a putrid stench of decay, and a grotesque assembly of scales, barnacles, and sinuous tendrils clings to what can only be described as a nightmare made of flesh. The ocean erupts around us, waves crashing against the boat like the blows of a giant. The boat rocks violently, threatening to capsize with each giant wave created by the beast's movements. The massive creature emerges further, each of its movements causing the sea around us to roil and swell with terrifying force. The sky above seems to darken as its massive bulk blocks out the sun, casting long, ominous shadows across the water. The ocean becomes a cauldron of chaos. Above the surface, the creature's enormous jaws clamp shut with a sound like thunder, its rows of jagged teeth ensnaring the hapless sharks. They thrash violently, caught in the creature's merciless grip, but it's a futile struggle. Like minnows ensnared in a net, they are swallowed whole, disappearing into the cavernous maw that seems almost to distort the water around it with its sheer mass.
Holy shit!
Tori gasps next to me. As the creature resubmerges, the water around us behaves like it's being sucked down a colossal drain. The pull is so strong, it feels like the ocean itself is trying to consume. Our rowboat, tiny and insignificant against this force, starts to tilt dangerously, the stern dipping into the swirling vortex. Suddenly, a monster wave, larger than any before, rears up like a behemoth. It's a towering wall of water, frothing at its crest, bearing down on us with the full wrath of the sea. My heart leaps into my throat, and for a moment, everything seems to slow down. I see Tori's widened eyes, the sky darkening above, the sheer power of nature bearing down on us. Then the wave crashes. The impact is titanic. Our boat is thrown like a toy, spinning uncontrollably. I lose my grip on the oar, my hands numb and slick with sea spray. I'm tossed sideways, and for a horrifying second, I'm airborne, flung across the churning waters. "Tori!" I manage to yell before the cold ocean envelops me, muffling my cry. The water is shockingly cold, a brutal embrace that saps my strength instantly. I struggle against the pull, disoriented, my lungs burning for air. Just as I feel the darkness creeping at the edges of my vision, a strong grip encircles my wrist. Tori. She's beside me in the water. With remarkable strength, she hauls me back towards the semi-submerged boat. Together, we fight the ocean's grip, struggling back into the battered vessel. "Come on, Josh, we're not dying today," she yells. We manage to right the boat, clinging to it as another wave lifts us up and then drops us in a sickening plunge. As the creature descends into the depths, the chaos of the ocean subsides with unnatural speed, like a nightmare fading at dawn. The water around us grows strangely still, eerily calm. The monstrous waves that had just threatened to swallow us whole now retreat, leaving behind only the gentle lapping of water against our boat. The sky above brightens slightly, casting pale light on the slick surface of the sea. It's as if the ocean itself wanted to forget the horror it just unleashed. Tori and I sit in our battered rowboat, soaked to the bone, breathing heavily from our exertion and fear. We exchange glances, our eyes wide with the shared terror of what we've just seen. The only sounds now are the distant cries of seagulls circling above, their sharp squawks a reminder of normalcy. They dive and swoop, their white bodies contrast against the grey sky, searching for any scraps thrown up by the recent disturbance. But even their presence feels off, as if they too sense the unnatural calm. Exhausted and still reeling from the ordeal, Tori and I row the battered boat back towards the shore. Each stroke is laboured, our muscles burning from the exertion and adrenaline finally wearing off. The coastline looks impossibly distant, but the terror of what lurks beneath propels us forward, urging us to the safety of land. As we near the beach, the mundane scene is surreal. Kids are still building sandcastles, and tourists are sunbathing, oblivious to the nightmare that unfolded just beyond the buoys. But as we drag our boat onto the sand, our soaked uniforms and wild looks draw immediate attention. "Call 911, I yell to the nearest bystander, my voice hoarse. Within minutes, the local police and paramedics arrive, their vehicles cutting through the sandy landscape. Tori and I are pulled aside, wrapped in blankets despite the summer heat, as we shiver, not just from the cold, but from the shock. Paramedics check us over for injuries, their faces a mixture of concern and disbelief as we recount what happened. The Coast Guard was called in, and by late afternoon, a flotilla of boats dotted the horizon, including a couple of oceanographic research vessels that had been redirected to investigate our reports. The beach was officially evacuated, yellow tape fluttering in the sea breeze as tourists were gently but firmly asked to pack up and leave. Local news crews, having caught wind of the incident, arrived with cameras and microphones, eager to capture the story. Tori and I were too shaken to speak on camera. In the days that followed, the beach remained closed. The water was patrolled continuously by boats equipped with sonar and other research equipment, trying to detect any further signs of the creature or its whereabouts. Scientists and marine biologists were brought in, providing their expertise, hypothesizing about what the creature could be. Was it some dormant deep-sea species, or something unknown entirely? The incident became the talk of the town, and soon a wider curiosity. Articles about historical sea monster sightings resurfaced, and everyone had a theory or a tale to tell. As the investigations continued without any conclusive findings, life in Wildwood gradually started to return to normal. The beach reopened, albeit with new warning signs and an increased number of patrols. Tourists returned, a little more cautious, but still eager to enjoy the sun and sand. The day finally arrives. It's a sticky August morning, and the sun is already high, casting sharp shadows across Tori's driveway as we load the last of her boxes into the back of her well-worn hatchback. She's managed to fit her whole life into a series of suitcases and cardboard boxes, each one labelled with a marker in her slanted handwriting. There's a moment of silence between us, filled with everything we're both feeling but aren't quite ready to voice. So, save some of the partying for me when I start next year, okay? I say, trying to keep the mood light. Can't have you experiencing all the fun without me. Tori bumps her shoulder against mine, a soft smile on her lips.
Deal. But you have to promise to visit, okay?
I chuckle, shifting the last box into place, securing it with a bungee cord. You're not worried it'll look kinda lame for a college girl to be seen hanging out with a high school kid? I tease, arching an eyebrow as I glance over at her. The morning breeze lifts strands of her brunette hair, which she brushes back absent-mindedly. Tori laughs, her blue eyes crinkling at the corners.
Oh, please, like I care about that. You'll probably be cooler than half the guys I meet there anyway. Besides,
she adds, her voice dropping a bit softer.
How many of them can say they encountered the Kraken and live to talk about it?
She nudges me playfully with her elbow, the tension from our earlier days dissipating like the morning mist.
I'm really gonna miss this. Miss you.
She murmurs, her voice tinged with a sincerity that catches me off guard. The weight of her impending departure suddenly feels all the more real. I swallow, my heart thudding loudly in my chest. Yeah, I'm gonna miss you too, Tori. She bites her lip, hesitating for a moment before reaching up to touch my cheek. It's a simple gesture, but it sends a jolt through me, electric and warm. I lean in to touch her, closing the gap between us. Our eyes lock, and everything else fades away. The sound of distant waves, the cries of the seagulls, the rustle of the leaves. It's just Tori and me, and the years of unspoken feelings that have built up between us. Gently, I cup her face with my hands, her skin soft under my fingertips. Before you go, I start, and she nods, understanding immediately. There's no need for more words. I lean in, and our lips meet. It's a sweet kiss, tentative at first, but growing more confident as we both give into it. Her lips are warm, and they taste faintly of the saltwater taffy.
We should do that more often.
Tori jokes, her voice light, but her eyes are serious. Yeah, I agree, my voice rough with emotion. We should. We linger by the car for a few more moments, neither of us eager to end it. Text me when you get there, okay? I say. Tori nods.
I will. Don't worry. I'll spam you so much you'll get sick of me.
I chuckle, but there's a tightness in my throat. Tori tosses me one last smile before she slides behind the wheel. As she drives away, I watch until her car is just a speck on the horizon, the road dust settling back down, and the quiet of the day wrapping around me like a comforting blanket. I'm not sure what the future holds, but for the first time, I'm ready to face it with an open heart. I stroll over to the dunes with my hands in my short pockets, my feet sinking slightly into the warm sand. The sun is high enough now that its rays feel like gentle fingers, not yet the pressing palm of midday heat. I climb to the top of a dune and sit down, pulling my knees close. From here, I have a perfect view of the Atlantic, stretching out endless and deep. The Jersey shore is peaceful today, deceptive in its calm. Families are arriving, setting up umbrellas and laying out blankets, kids running towards the waves with shrieks of delight. Part of me keeps scanning the horizon, half expecting to see those jaws breach the surface again.